Dungeon 42. By S. Jackson. Chapter 21. Encyclopedia Udfukica. Several minutes passed as I contemplated what to do about the sword. Looking at the Deconstruct tab again, I noticed that there was a pattern among the materials that would be generated. That resolved most of my initial misgivings. I still had a fuck ton to think about, but those thoughts could wait till later. I okayed the deconstruction despite the mana cost. An 8-hour timer appeared. I was accustomed to minutes for common items. It made sense that something listed as legendary would take a lot longer. That didn't make me any less impatient but helped a little. Looking at the list of materials, I found some mundane items like enamel and some boxes with question marks. One had a legible name and stuck out to me. Look up Gilnamar, I thought, and was rewarded with an encyclopedia entry. Gilnamar, legendary. A metal that develops from iron exposed to high concentrations of earth mana. Rarely naturally occurring, it was once a major export of the Mage King's empire. Several colleges were devoted expressly to its creation. The method was lost after the death of the fifth Mage King and the empire's collapse. The mythology that developed around it led to the near extinction of silver giants. While difficult to manufacture and the weakest of legendary metals on its own, it is a key component in many legendary and epic alloys. The factual information was followed by some bits about historic uses, which wasn't that interesting. Under that was something more colorful. Common beliefs. A metal culled from the blood of silver giants, it grants strange powers to a blade but curses its bearer. Those who wield blades made of it will be unstoppable in combat. In all other things, they find misfortune. A good old-fashioned blessed with suck weapon according to the locals. It was good to know that was BS. Making cursed swords would be cool, but I wanted to have the stuff to make normal ones too. Or swords that started as normal anyway. Despite how fun the idea of becoming a magical arms manufacturer seemed to me, breaking the weapon down had cost mana. I didn't anticipate the parts populating to my store for free. Even so, it looked like I was going to have something fun to play with soonish. Instinctively, I started looking at the related article links and didn't emerge for nearly an hour. When I did, it was mostly an accident, the hounds splashing and barking catching my attention. Oof, it wasn't good to get caught up reading like that. The fact I had to wait on the timer for the sword made it tempting. Fortunately, since refresh had already hit, I had mana to keep me occupied while I waited instead. My first instinct was to buy a bunch of defensive items, but I refrained. I'd already put in basic defenses after careful consideration. It wouldn't be good to mess things up by being hasty, just because I had mana to burn now. I'd have to exercise patience again and properly plan my next expansion. Before that happened though, it was about time to check in on my house guest. I'd neglected him for a bit longer than I should have, all things considered. I found him in essentially the same condition I'd left him, unconscious and still heavily injured. Not good. I'd assumed the potion would fix him up fully, but obviously it had already reached the limit of its effectiveness. I felt like a dumbass for not checking sooner. After seeing its effect push out an arrowhead and seal the wound, I'd assumed it was a cure-all. Clearly, it had limits, and I took a minute to study the potions in the mana shop. The one I'd given him was a minor healing potion. It could remove physical status ailments like bleeding and would heal a fifth of the recipient's health points, HP. At a guess, pushing the arrowhead out had been part of removing the status ailment in this case. Being more thorough this time, I selected 2 potions to give him. The first was a slightly more expensive physical healing potion. It cost me 10 mana and would increase his healing rate and resistance to mundane physical status ailments. It seemed like a good option to keep infection at bay without immediately waking him up. The second potion was a hydration potion and would keep him hydrated for a week. Fortunately, the potion's descriptions indicated they could be given to an unconscious person safely. I didn't want to fuck around and accidentally drown him. As I was giving him the hydration potion, I noticed a bare shoulder peeking out from under the blanket. Crop, I'd forgotten I stripped him. I wanted to dress him the moment I noticed but hesitated. I'd done it with the system which hadn't involved contact or seeing anything. I'd seen his older comrades in the buck, but they were grown men. I was far more reluctant to get an eyeful of underage ass. Determined to avoid the issue, I started fussing with my inventory system. A few tries later, I found I could in fact equip the clothes to him directly. Relieved, I dressed him properly, then washed my hands of worrying about him for a couple of hours. It was dungeon time. First up on my list of things to sort out was the hounds. They were costing me a small amount of mana in upkeep which I was reluctant to pay. Studying their data, I found the problem. They needed regular proximity to at least 40 tiles with a heat rating close to that of their natural habitat. I had 15 freebie lava environment titles from the tutorial, which meant I was 25 short. That was quite a bit, unfortunately. The normal cost for a 40 by 40 tile generated by the local terrain in the store was 1 mana. The lava tiles were listed as exotic and cost 5 mana each. Thinking back to the tutorial, there had only been 10 types of them in the tutorial mana shop. I'd added 15 myself using Agony's trick and was grateful to find they were all still available. It would be adding insult to injury if I could only buy the blandest of them for such a stiff price. Curious, I checked how much it would cost to buy exterior plots of land. Unlike the lava environment stuff, they were listed as local surface terrain. They cost 2 mana each, but were only 20 by 20 feet in size. Twice the cost for half the size. It wasn't awful, but I had to wonder why they didn't just sell them as 10-foot squares for 1 mana. That irrelevant mystery aside, it was time to start planning my next phase. That meant deciding on what I wanted to do, both above and below ground. Knocking out the daily upkeep cost was an obvious choice, but I wasn't in a hurry. I decided to spread that out over 5 days and bought 5 tiles to add to the pool area. The rest was more complicated. One thing I knew I didn't want was to be caught with my pants down if something happened. To that end, I decided to reserve half of my mana for the day. It would be held as an emergency fund until just before the day's refresh hit. That left me with 20 mana to play with. Mana I was likewise reluctant to spend, since I didn't have a solid plan in play yet. Wanting to correct the problem, I started studying my existing layout. The modifications I had already made addressed some basic defense concepts, but haven't altered the overall layout that drastically. It was still made up of a series of tunnels, many of which led downward at various intervals. What it lacked were distinct layers. Technically, it didn't have to have them, but I liked the classical idea of a dungeon. For me, that meant a series of levels that parties descended. Each one functioning as an added layer of defenses for my core also had its appeal. It wasn't a small or quick task. Knowing I'd be in deep planning mode, I decided to start breaking down and refining the mundane items and materials I had on hand. The activity wasn't a priority, but it was something I didn't need to give much thought. All I had to do was listen for the ding from a timer and throw new items in as needed. Once that was underway, I got back to the more involved task. To start, I picked where the first layer would end and the stairs to the next would be. The tunnel heights were all over the place, but I carefully brought them in line on a single layer. Making sure the lower ones remained connected was a little tricky, but I managed not to trigger the build alarm too often. By the time I was done, I had 4 messy layers. The lowest one was more like a large room where the lava area and my core were. Some elements of the defenses I'd set up remained intact, but most were compromised. Since I still had my original note, it wasn't too hard to clean things up, just time-consuming. I had to cut off sections, straighten out planes, and make sure all requirements were met again. By the end, I had a functional set of layers with good essential defenses in a pool of pruned tiles. The excess tiles I hadn't found a home for I labeled my roughing in set. They were plain things, but useful for trying out floor plan elements I wasn't sure about. When a timer dinged, I popped open the crafting interface and felt my orbs flicker a couple of times in surprise. I thought the lantern I'd put in it had finished processing, but it still had a few minutes. It was the second slot that was blank. The sword had finished being dismantled. 8 hours had really flown by while I was in the zone. Excited, I looked through what the process had yielded for me to play with. Corroded Gilner, F1 grade, legendary. The metal has been exposed to a corrosive of epic or higher grade. It is not usable in its current state. Bummer. My first instinct was to see if it could be salvaged, but I resisted. The boxes that had been filled with question marks had changed and now featured text. Degraded unknown blood, F1 grade, legendary. Blood of a powerful being, degraded to the point of being unidentifiable. Ominous, but it made me think maybe the blade had been quenched in blood. That felt very sword and sorcery appropriate to me, though I couldn't prove it. It could have just as easily splashed on the blade at some point and stained it, as it were. I didn't really have a way to find out aside from asking the kid. If he even knew about it. Basilisk venom, grade F1, mythical. Venom of a basilisk that has lost most of its corrosive power. What the fuck? Chapter 22. Venomous developments. Looking at the basilisk venom, my brain filled with question marks. It was a monster I was familiar with conceptually, but its venom ranking mythical threw me for a loop. I realized a little late I didn't actually know how the ranking system worked. Easy way to fix that. Item rankings. Common, uncommon, rare, masterwork, legendary, epic, mythic, divine/demonic. Beginning at masterwork, items may exhibit unusual or magical properties or be endowed with them. Items of lower rank can only be given magical properties temporarily. Divine/demonic. Items of this rank can only be created by a higher being of an appropriate alignment. Unique. Items with this attribute occur in legendary and above tiers. They are not reproducible by the system. Okay, so the Gilnamar was special, but Basilisk Venom was the most special. Specialist? Specialier? A nightmare item I didn't know how to feel about owning? All questions to be ignored until later. Item grades. F, E, D, C, B, A, S. All grades have 10 ranks. Items must be at maximum rank for their grade in order to be upgraded to the next grade. Good to know. I was still giving the Basilisk Venom the side eye. I hadn't looked it up yet, but it seemed dangerous as shit. It had corroded metal, fantasy bullshit metal, not just an organic, like flesh. I didn't know how Z14 would react to it, and I honestly didn't want to find out. Basilisk Venom. A poisonous secretion from glands in the mouth of a basilisk, rendering its saliva toxic. It is lethal to all mortal creatures, potentially deadly even to immortals, and capable of corroding all metals except those of mythic rank. The speed of corrosion depends on the metal's ranking and composition. Phoenix tears, mythical, must be used to resurrect a soul that died from the venom to remove the taint. Not exactly cheerful news, and I felt an acidic tingle of unease about the potentially deadly even to immortals bit. It seemed fine to have it in my inventory, but I kept having this weird fear the container would overturn and it would start burning me from the inside. Not exactly a sensible fear, but fear wasn't inclined to concern itself with such niceties. It was surprising to find the basilisk itself sounded like an endgame level boss. I was used to thinking of it as something more like a mid-game one. An annoying one you had to slog through a poisoned swamp to get it, but not can maybe kill that which does die and taint the soul itself. Just yikes. Basilisk, monster, demonic, unique. A fragment of the world eater that regenerated into a lesser monster. Its gaze could petrify, its bite was venomous, and it emitted a poisonous gas as a breath weapon. Its very presence was corruptive, turning water acidic and causing mutations in plant and animal life that survived near it. The majority of its life was spent in hibernation, with brief periods of wakefulness in a cycle similar to the world eaters, played out over a small time scale. It was slain, but its body continues to taint the environment around it, creating a massive poisonous swamp. Holy shit, this thing was a nightmare even in death. I was deeply happy it was tagged as unique. No world needed one, let alone more, of something like that roaming around. That it was just a fragment of something and defined as a lesser monster in comparison was its own kind of disturbing. World Eater, I said aloud when thinking it failed to produce anything. A blank prompt opened and jumbled text and runes started to appear, then fade at random before an error tone rang out and it closed on its own. My orbs flickered. Today was just chock full of disturbing surprises. Yep, all of that was getting filed under well fuck, and that venom wasn't going to see the light of day again. Not as long as I got a say in the matter anyway. Shaking off my unease, I decided to see if the corroded Gilnamar was salvageable. Before, I'd been interested in making magic swords for fun and possibly profit, but now I was concerned for my safety. If stuff like that basilisk was roaming around the world, I might need to defend myself from something worse than adventurers at some point. It cost me 5 mana to produce enough of the damaged Gilnamar to make a usable bar of undamaged F1 grade. Checking the sword's requirements, I needed 3 of the newly fixed bars to make it. That would cost me 5 points a bar. I flinched at the cost, but still checked on how much upgrading it would set me back. The answer was 5 bars to increase it from F1 to F2 grade. Interesting, but not something I was inclined to bother with for the moment. I stopped just short of crafting the sword, needing to think a bit. While I thought, I put the other items for its construction into the interface to improve them. I probably didn't need S-grade enamel and leather, but it was something to do. It was also free, so why not? I hesitated because of the dilemma about what to do with the sword's original owner. I didn't have any particular desire to kill him, but the hero vibe I got off him was strong. It didn't sit right with me to steal his sword. A well-done villain had its charms, but I must have been a sucker for heroes before. Was a sucker for heroes now. I didn't know where the feeling came from, but not knowing didn't change how I felt. This kid could be something really cool and I didn't want to ruin that. Either way though, I was going to make the sword. I started the crafting process. It would take 4 hours, half the time it took to deconstruct it. I felt like the difference was a reflection of the lack of basilisk venom. Once the timer was up, I checked on the boy's status. His hit points were at full and his status was normal. A good sign, even though he was still sleeping. At an earlier point in the day, I'd felt like I should talk to him. Now I'd returned to that idea but felt nervous. It was still worth a try, but I felt uncomfortable as I approached the room where I'd stashed him and dragged my feet. Tail? I took my time, which turned out to be a lifesaver as I floated by the remains of the bandits and paused. Laying dismembered and burned in the tunnel, they were a gruesome sight. Time and the fact the hounds had been feeding on them hadn't added anything pleasant to the scene. Fuck. I chucked the bodies into the core room hastily. A shiver reminding me of a cold sweat running down my spine as I did. Yep, that would have been perfect. Have a nice chat with the boy about how I wasn't going to kill him, then have him walk out to that scene. That wouldn't have been trauma-inducing at all. Mary, mother of fuck. I swore violently. There were still 2 of his dead comrades just laying around, naked. I'd raided their bodies but left them outside the entrance the entire time. They were on a tile I owned, so I hastily relocated them several feet into the dirt. What I did was too violent and inconsiderate to be called a burial, but it happened. The last thing I wanted to be known for was being the naked death dungeon. Beware yet, oh adventures. This one doesn't just kill yet, it takes your dignity. I could picture the rough sound of a one-eyed crazy man spreading the tale from bar to bar. It would be the literal death of me if adventurers were too weirded out to approach my dungeon and I failed to make my tithe. Ow. Shit. A voice that didn't belong to me or the hound said, followed by clattering gear. It seemed the boy was awake and had found his pack with his shin. Damn it. Who knew what other horrible things were still laying around? Time for some fast cleaning. Chapter 23. Awkward Introduction. Elim woke to find himself in pitch blackness. Thinking he might have gone blind, he struggled up only to bash himself on a wall and cry out in pain. The jolt of pain brought a little clarity and he ceased to panic, carefully finding the wall with his hands and staying still. "Hello," he called out. The last thing he could remember happening was being shot with an arrow. That didn't explain his blindness, but suggested someone had helped him. Particularly after he inspected himself and failed to find the arrow's shaft still sticking out of his shoulder. Strangely, he didn't even find evidence of a wound. He couldn't help but shiver at that, wondering if he'd been bedridden with fever long enough for it to have healed. That would neatly explain why he'd lost his sight. It didn't happen often, but he'd heard of such things. You should probably sit down. You might be a little weak," a woman's voice said. Elim froze. The voice was pleasant yet deeply wrong. Like two different women speaking slightly out of sync. "Am I blind?" Elim asked, that worry overriding all others. "What? No, why would you think?" "Oh. Oh shit," the woman said. Though hers was the only distinct voice, he felt like he could hear others speaking quietly. It seemed she was not alone. "Okay, yet. I didn't think about lighting." "Cover your eyes, I'll light a lantern," she said. Elim did as instructed. There was a bit more low conversation before a clink of metal on stone. "All right, lantern's lit. Go slowly so you don't dazzle your eyes," she added. This time Elim felt like her voice sounded like his mother's and a barmaid he'd once favored. It was an unsettling combination, to say the least. Once he opened his eyes and they adjusted, he found himself in a small stone room. To his left was a stone trough of water large enough to lay in, and on his right a bedroll and his pack. Or at least a pack that looked like his old one, it was too new. Right ahead was an empty doorway. The lantern hung beside it on a peg and spilled a bit of light into the darkness beyond. It revealed a stretch of stone floor, but nothing else. "Good to finally see you up and about, kid. You've been asleep for nearly 2 days, the lady said cheerfully. "I'm 24 springs a man," Elim countered, confused rather than offended. "You couldn't enlist until you were." "That's not even old enough to buy beer where I'm from," she replied. Yapping laughter accompanied her words. It sounded like dogs but not quite, as if the sound were mixed with the whispering crackle of a hearth. "I appreciate your kindness to me, madam," Elim said with false cheer, more confused than before. There was no age limit on drinking liquor, let alone beer. "I'm Elim and I believe I owe you my life," he still bowed as he spoke. His mother had taught him manners and he wasn't shy about using them. "Let's not do the owing lives thing," she countered. Elim blinked, uncertain of her reasoning. A life debt wasn't a small matter but she sounded uncomfortable at the prospect. "So it's lovely to meet you. Now, if you'll promise not to hurt me then you can go." "Sound good?" she asked. It was a favor she needn't ask for even if she hadn't saved his life. Elim had never raised his hand to a woman let alone a benefactor. "Madam, I'll throw in a hydration potion so you can get across the sand easier," she offered hastily, cutting him off. "Your comrades already left, but I spotted some horses in the valley so you should be able to make it without a problem." "I'll throw in a potion for the horse too," she continued when Elim failed to respond. Elim said nothing as he took in her words. He had only a vague notion of what hydration meant. The word with his full attention was potion. "You have potions?" he asked flatly in disbelief. "Yeah, that's why you're not dead." "I can make a few different kinds," she replied with a cheerful bluntness that left Elim speechless. Take your time to think about it, maybe have a walk around and stretch," she continued nervously. Dumbstruck, Elim stood rooted to the spot until finally, his mind started moving again. Several moments had passed since she fell silent. "Wait!" Elim shouted, hoping she hadn't gone far. "Eh? What?" she said, sounding no further away. Aleem blushed in embarrassment, but couldn't afford to let it tongue-tie him a second time. My mother is ill. Do you have anything that could cure blue vein fever? Aleem asked. Between the voice and her scorn for his age, he knew he wasn't dealing with anything human even before potions were mentioned. She'd even offered him one for his horse of all things. Blue vein? Hold on, she started, but her voice dropped. Aleem could still make out the faint sound of conversation in hushed tones. The strange hearth-like voices were back and he waited patiently. It was not a short wait. After a while he sat down and started rummaging through the pack that looked like his, looking for food. Though he hadn't felt anything when he woke, once he thought of it he felt ravenous. Aleem dug out jerky and what looked like hardtack. It wasn't until the bread gave way slightly at his touch with a crisp sound that he realized it was something else. Hardtack would do for a doorstop in a pinch and had to be soaked in water to be something close to edible. Taking an experimental bite, he found the dry crisp herb bread tasted good and could be chewed without tooth damage. He stuffed it in his mouth greedily and checked what was else in the bag. He found a few bags of dried herbs and spices, but nicer than his own, roasted nuts, and palm-sized wheels of cheese with thick wax rinds. Feeling as if he'd been starved for weeks rather than asleep a few days, Aleem stuffed himself like a chipmunk. Ears ringing with the sound of his own chewing, he lost track of time and didn't hear the quiet conversation outside come to an end. So, I know of 6 diseases that might be called that. What are the symptoms, I mean signs of it? Aside from the veins bit, she asked. Aleem almost choked as he swallowed a mouthful of jerky in surprised haste. After a heavy swig from his canteen and some coughing, he could breathe freely again. Dude, take it easy. I'm not in a hurry, the lady said anxiously. Aleem nodded as he took a few moments to regain a semblance of composure. Ordering his thoughts took longer. Had he said blue veins to anyone else, they would have immediately known the scourge he was referring to. He pondered the lady's choice of words as much as his own answer. It comes on like a cold, but then the veins in the arms begin to color first. It spreads to the body and the afflicted sleep unnaturally long until it passes. Children usually die. My mother caught it looking after my daughter when she had it, Aleem explained with a heavy heart. He was grateful for his daughter's recovery but stricken that his mother suffered for it. My mother's health is fragile. It will likely kill her, he added. It should have been him looking after Bessie, but his enlistment wouldn't end for 2 years yet. He had to go where he was ordered or face the noose. It had been bad luck to be selected for the inspection. He'd already been gone for a month before Bessie started showing signs. Okay. Yeah, the sleeping thing is unique to one of them, the most problematic one, the lady said, then sighed. Aleem felt a chill run down his spine at problematic. The veins part isn't the sickness itself, it's an immune, it's your body fighting it off. Others only seem to catch a cold, but it's the early stage of something you probably know as bloody mana fever, she explained. Aleem felt the chill from problematic spread in a shiver through his entire body as his heart pounded in fear. It left him deaf to all else for a long while. It then sleeps in the body for a while before coming back in its lethal form, the lady continued. Aleem knew he had missed a great deal, but could barely process what he'd learned. Blue veins was an unfortunate affliction, but bloody mana fever was a monstrosity. Those who came down with it would suffer vomiting and diarrhea before beginning to bleed from the eyes. Healing magic would only make it worse, the body's mana perverted by the disease in some way, which gave it its name. My mother has bloody mana fever, he asked, needing to hear it said clearly. Yes, but she and your daughter fought it off. It won't turn into bloody mana for them. That's what getting blue veins means, the lady explained. Aleem felt relieved, but his solace was short-lived. As terrible as the condition was, death wasn't uncommon in the lands. What made bloody mana so feared was how contagious it was. It had decimated entire regions before when rulers failed to act quickly. Earl Savix was not a man prone to indecision. Lady, you are wise in medicine and can make potions. If an outbreak occurs, the village will be burned and everyone who came in contact with it killed. Do you have a means of stopping it? He asked. The lives of his mother and daughter were his first priority, but he wouldn't ignore the village. Even if they were strangers rather than the people he'd grown up among, he couldn't knowingly stand by and do nothing. At least not if there was anything within his means to be done. Death wasn't a stranger to him, but slaughter on that level was something else entirely. This thing is a nasty bastard, the lady said nervously. Elim nodded in agreement with the description. Silence followed for a brief while as she conferred with the other voices again. Without any appetite left, Elim waited silently for her decision. Phew, she muttered after a while. Elim laughed, feeling as if he could sympathize with her distress. He got to his feet and bowed in the direction of the doorway. No matter if she could see it or not, he would show her respect. Lady, no matter what you decide, you have my solemn promise I'll work no harm against you. You're my benefactor and I'm not so ungrateful as to scorn someone who has shown me kindness, Elim said calmly. He'd been too surprised by the mention of potions to answer her earlier request for a promise. Now he was giving it late, but it was no less sincere for the timing. And no matter what you decide about the village, you have my thanks. It's not my place to ask more of you. Though, if you are willing, I will gladly take what you offer, he added. Why someone chose to help or refrain was a personal decision he didn't feel he had a right to judge. Particularly when dealing with magical matters. Even if something looked easy, that didn't mean it came without any cost. Kid, the answer is maybe, but it means making a deal with me, she said finally, sounding vexed. I assume you're about to tell me why I should have a problem with that, Elim said with a raised brow. He'd loved stories as a boy, the stranger, and more gruesome the better. There were plenty of things other than humans walking the skin of the world. Some were mortal beings, little different aside from a few quirks of their form or a talent or two. Then there were things more other in nature. Those had always been at the center of his favorite tales. Supernatural beings who bestow curses and blessings. Which of their gifts was a blessing and which was a curse was a matter left up to one's own judgment. He'd never thought she was human in the first place and had prepared himself mentally to make a deal. He didn't feel any particular fear at the prospect. Once he got past the strangeness of her voice, he found she seemed little different from a mortal being. Instead of alien logic or unfathomable intent, she sounded like she wanted to help, but didn't know if she could or possibly should. It might have been naive, but he felt even if she was something beyond human understanding, he needn't fear this lady. Well, showing would probably. She paused and he heard a scuffle. Seriously? Just let me. Hey. Okay. Okay. Ripping the band-aid off, the lady said. Elim looked to the doorway but saw nothing. Something about that was odd, but it took him a moment to figure out what. The lantern's light should have still illuminated a patch of barren stone beyond the doorway. Something shifted in that deeper darkness. A suggestion of form. Madame Elim started only to be cut off by a deep growl. A moment later something dark entered the room, blocking the lantern's light fitfully. A pool of deeper shadows collapsed at his feet. As he studied the strange patch of darkness, a long thin arm emerged from the shadow, then another. Pushing up from the ground, a tail unfurled and a body was revealed as a creature with a vaguely feminine shape began to rise up silently. Finally, the hands made a slow flipping motion and something like hair was thrown back to reveal a pair of flames where eyes ought to have been. Chapter 24. Getting to know you. Hi, I said, as I finished getting my hair out of my face. I could hear the hounds laughing in the hall, but chose to ignore that. Elim looked pale, but oddly composed, once I got a good look at him. Madam, he said and bowed to me. It was the third time he'd done so, but the first time I wasn't watching him with the security feed. He still looked young to me, but it lent him an air of dignity. Something I envied, after being head-butted unceremoniously into the room. So, I'm a dungeon master, and you're sitting in my dungeon, I explained. He'd already seen me, so there wasn't any point in beating around the bush. Do you know much about either thing? I asked. Stories, Elim replied simply. Not a particularly illuminating answer. I waited a few moments, thinking he was going to elaborate, but realized he wasn't. He seemed to be taking things well, but he looked overwhelmed when I looked closer. So what did those stories say? I prompted. I could hardly blame him for not adapting to the situation instantly. That, not much really, Elim started, looking perplexed as he tried to get his answer together. They describe the famous dungeons heroes have defeated, mostly. Only a few mention dungeon masters built them and take power from the lives lost in them, but they don't really describe those beings or much else, he explained. Well, that's not really wrong, just kind of simple, I conceded. Dungeon master makes a dungeon, heroes fight in the dungeon, the survivor writes the story. It made sense that not much would be known in such a case. So, moving on, I pivoted awkwardly. Even if I wanted to elaborate, there wasn't much I could say. My own knowledge of the situation was rather barebones and likely irrelevant to anything he'd care about. It was better to focus on the more pressing issue of his village. With regard to your village, you probably have half a year before there's an outbreak of bloody mana fever, I explained, as I did some crude math while checking my encyclopedia. The incubation period was a year, but there was no guarantee of when people might have been exposed, so I was hedging. Going by what you said, and how contagious the bastard is, that means a larger outbreak will likely happen around then, which is the bigger problem. You said exposed people were tracked and killed. From when exactly? Is it anyone possibly exposed within a few months before the outbreak? I asked. I needed to know more to formulate a plan. It's not always possible, but the Earl tries to locate anyone who had contact within the preceding month, Elim replied and shivered. That was a lot of people, but the timeline was wrong to stop the spread. Well, that wasn't exactly true if you went fully scorched earth and burned the communities they came in contact with as well. That would have a huge body count though. Then your best bet is to cut and run with your family, since I can't predict when it will happen, I said honestly. There wasn't anything I could do about them getting swept up in a quarantine. You won't be contagious either, so you don't need to worry about spreading it, I added, hoping to soften the blow a bit. The kid probably didn't know anything about the concept of a typhoid Mary, but I felt it was worth mentioning. You said it was possible the village might be spared if I made a deal with you. I'd like to hear it, madam, Elim said with a determined look in his eyes. Points for bravery, I muttered. It wasn't likely that meeting my fiery orbs was easy to do, but he met them with a steady gaze. I did some math. Bloody mana fever was bad, but still listed as a non-magical disease. That meant a cheap 2-mana potion could deal with it. Given some time, I could build up a stockpile and deal with a small population of infected, but that wasn't the biggest issue. Even if they're cured, they'll still be implicated if another nearby community has an outbreak, I said bluntly. That was the sticking point in any potential plan. Then it's hopeless? Elim asked. That's a bit of a loaded question, kid, I replied bitterly. I knew a handful of facts about the world and jack about virology. Even if I were an expert, it still didn't address the quarantine issue. It wasn't like I could ask Earl Saveeks to make an expectation and wait to see if the people in question were sick before burning them. I apologize, it's unfair of me to burden you, Elim said, sincerely apologetic despite his disappointment. Looking at him, I felt something inside of me writhe uncomfortably. He had expressive eyes and it made me feel like I'd disappointed a golden retriever. Monstrous. Fuck. This wasn't my problem and could very well land me in trouble if I got involved. If he'd tried to guilt me into it or started sermonizing, I could have flatly said no. Instead, he'd just had to be polite about it. I racked my brain to try and think of something I could do with my limited knowledge and geographically locked abilities. Finally, I felt something click. Is there any kind of disease they quarantine for but don't burn the village over? A pox maybe? I asked as inspiration struck. Two I can think of, but why? He looked thunderstruck as he caught on. You mean to shut the village off before the outbreak? Exactly. It's the best I can come up with under the circumstances, I admitted. I didn't know any political judo or science workarounds, but I did know how to bullshit. I might as well play to my strengths. So long as the quarantine is for at least a year, they should be safe, I added. I was less certain about that part because life was unpredictable. I could say with reasonable confidence if anything did happen it wouldn't be because Elim and I hadn't done what we could. It's a clever solution. What might I do to repay you for your assistance? Elim asked. I gave him a couple more points for bravery, since he wasn't trying to see if I'd forget to ask for payment. He also perked up visibly, which was frustratingly adorable. Well, I'd like you to work for me, I said reluctantly. It was a big ask, so I expected some pushback. I intended to stand my ground though. In this place? Elim asked, expression going pale. Not the worst possible response. No, that wouldn't be terribly useful to me. What I need is a personal shopper. Right, probably not a thing here, I trailed off at the end. I didn't actually have too solid of a picture for what I wanted him to do, other than buy stuff for me to tinker with. Let's just get the basics out of the way for now, I said as I opened the contract interface. Pact terms. You agree not to cause harm or incite others to cause harm to, name pending, known to you as the lady through action or words. Name pending, the lady agrees not to cause harm or incite others to cause harm to you and your family through action or words. Protection extends to the family up to the generation of your grandchildren so long as they uphold the terms and do not attempt to cause harm to, name pending, the lady through actions or words or incite others to do so. Payment. Healing items required to identify and cure your mother's condition. 10 gold. Agree, yes/no. Elim was shocked when the contract appeared in front of him. He stared at it for a few moments before he actually started reading it, going by lack of eye movement. I didn't comment though, it was a weird-ass thing to have happened the first time. What do you mean by identifying her condition? He asked. You said your mother was sickly even before she came down with blue veins. As a gesture of good faith, I'll fix the underlying problem if I can, I explained. I couldn't guarantee anything, but my stable of potions gave me a fairly profound sense of confidence. Elim seemed more troubled by what I said than he had been by the appearance of the prompt. What do you mean by underlying problem? He asked. Well, without knowing more, I can't say what's causing it, so I left that part a bit vague. I didn't want to say I'd give you something to fix her lungs, then have it turn out to be something wrong with her other organs or thyroid, I explained and winced afterward. Thyroids were probably a foreign concept, unless the field of anatomical study was more advanced than the state of things suggested. Does the cause matter? Elim asked. Well, yeah. You wouldn't treat a broken leg like you would a cold, I said, then felt like an ass. It wasn't such an unreasonable a question since magic was a thing. Also, it wasn't like I was even pretending to be a doctor. I'd probably assume RPG rules and that potions were cure-alls if I hadn't already read their descriptions. They still kind of were, but they had types and strengths to consider. You think it isn't a sickness? Elim asked in surprise. It might be, but it's also possible something is wrong with her constitution. I said, struggling for a description that would make sense, or a dysfunction of the organs. Wouldn't those have claimed her as a child? Elim asked, confused more than anything. I don't know for sure since I can't assess her from here. It could still be a disease, but if it's not, then there are plenty of reasons it might not have shown up until she was older, I said with a feeling like I was moving into murky water. I didn't honestly know that much about medicine. What I could come up with felt like the sort of stuff gleaned off the odd online article and half slept through biology class rather than dedicated learning. Despite that, I didn't think I was likely wrong, especially since I was only addressing general concepts instead of specifics. It might have been there when she was younger but wasn't as severe. Or it could have been aggravated by some change in her lifestyle. Those only apply if it is inborn. If it isn't, something could have caused it later, I continued. Everything I'd said could be summarized as, it could be just about anything. Despite how little I'd really said, Aleem had been nodding along as if I were dispensing great wisdom. That made me feel a bit uneasy. It was possible what I was saying was advanced compared with local medical knowledge, but that did not make me competent. When you say it, it seems simple, Aleem said morosely, yet even the divine healers said nothing of the sort. Only that she was beyond their help. Well, what happens when divine healing fails? Do they get a revelation of why? I asked. I knew absolutely nothing about divine magic. No, they do not, Aleem said, expression hardening. How does divine healing even work? Do they have to ask for something specific or does it heal anything wrong? I asked. They pray to the gods for a type of healing of a certain strength, so if it's wrong or too weak, they wouldn't know. Aleem asked rhetorically. Gods be good, could she have been cured if they had checked first? Aleem looked furious. Fuck. It seemed like I'd accidentally touched on a sore spot. It was a little late to think of it now, but I'd probably turned his worldview upside down a time or two. It didn't help the revelation was a shitty one. A good number of people had probably died because they asked for or were offered the wrong type of healing in the past. I knew from personal experience sometimes you needed space to process things. Trying to be considerate, I waited a couple of minutes while Aleem fumed. Despite my intentions, I found the way he was hatefully staring into the middle distance a bit unnerving. Agony had helped me out and I felt like I should try to do the same. I reached out to pat Aleem on the shoulder. I knew I'd made a mistake the second my hand touched down, which was far too late. Agony was tiny and adorable, whereas I was a big-ass shadow monster. Aleem's eyes went wide in surprise as he threw his body to the side in shock. He lost his footing in his attempt to escape and hit the floor, then scuttled back until he hit a wall. Surprised, I'd reared up until my head struck the ceiling. We just stared at each other, him breathing hard and something inside of me racing in panic. Shit. I was probably looming. No, it was a high ceiling, I was definitely looming. Fuck. Chapter 25. Healthy Boundaries. Aleem, I started. I apologize. He said, panicked as he scrambled to kneel. I felt like more of an idiot. I scared him, I knew that, but here I was still fucking looming. I could control myself up to a certain point, but like hair standing on end, this wasn't a completely conscious thing. I probably needed to relax, but I was way too embarrassed for that to happen anytime soon. The poor bastard seemed to think he'd offended me, which only made calming down harder. Oh okay, let's I'm going back out now. You sit or whatever's comfortable, I said, then made good on my word after a beat. Still hovering higher than before, I had to awkwardly pull myself down to get under the top of the door. I gave up on trying to pretend to be nonchalant and just went back into the hallway completely. At least he couldn't see me looking like a Japanese horror film monster in the middle of a spaz attack. Stalin and the lady hound looked at me pityingly, which helped nothing. Madam. Aleem called, and I peeked around the corner immediately, only to flinch back. I didn't want to surprise him a second time. A moment later, the contract I'd sent him registered as accepted. I apologize for my behavior. I was lost in thought and you startled me, Aleem said graciously. I looked around the edge of the doorway once more. Apology accepted, I said despite feeling a little reluctant. My pride was still bruised. Literal monster or not, having someone react like that after we seemed to be getting along hurt. His apology did help me calm down a little though, and bit by bit, I started hovering at a more normal height again. I should have respected your personal spa. I felt a heavy hit from behind. The pattering sound preceding it suddenly made sense as one of the hounds head butted me in the ass. Pushed back into the room, I floundered for a moment. Great, first I'd started looming, now I'd done a jump scare, just fucking perfect. It took a moment for the sound of Aleem's laughter to register. I'm sorry. It's just he couldn't contain himself. Looking back toward the door, I found Stalin and the lady hound peeking in with their jaws open in wide grins. Seeing me look, they immediately retreated. Any sense of penance or fear was dispelled by the sound of yapping laughter. -2 to the dungeon master's dignity confirmed. Despite feeling pissed and having godlike power in my domain, I elected not to do anything. The lady hound had gotten me by surprise the first time. This time it was my own fault for not paying attention. When I turned back, Aleem was more composed and he quickly bowed to me. I've been rude to you twice. I apologize, mistress. It was unbecoming, he said, looking positively knightly. I felt like he would have been a troublesome kid to raise, since it seemed hard to get mad at him. Fuck. I wanted to be mad at someone, but everyone just had to be fucking adorable. It legitimately wasn't fair. You mentioned before that you wished to employ me. Aleem asked. Right, the main point, the thing I should be getting back to. Yet. Helping your village is one thing, but I have a personal reason to want to get rid of the disease and tear out its roots, I said honestly. You do? Can disease harm you? Aleem asked, sounding like he didn't quite believe it. I doubt it, I replied. It wasn't likely that Z14 was susceptible to anything so mundane as a plague. The why isn't something I want to talk about right now. I'll send you a job offer and you can consider the terms of it on your trip back home, I continued. On my trip? You're releasing me, now? Aleem asked with wide eyes. Yet? I wasn't planning on holding you prisoner in the first place, I said, tilting my head. Exactly what kind of impression had I made on this kid? Pardon me. I didn't mean to imply anything. I guess I just expected more? Like bargaining or? You don't really seem much like them, but there are some stories about dungeon masters, Aleem said, tripping over his words as he rushed to explain his explanation. Honestly, I thought you might demand I be your slave. No. I shouted. Aleem didn't run this time, though he did take a step back and turn pale. I'd risen up a little, but not enough to hit the ceiling this time. I had to wonder what my face was doing for him to drain of color like that. Look, I'm not like this because I chose to be. So I'm not inclined to force people into a similar position, I said finally. The idea of slaves set my figurative teeth on edge because I was basically one. Compliance or death were my options. You didn't choose to be a dungeon master? Aleem asked gently. Shit, the easy answer was yes, but it was also kind of a lie. Now looking at his big blue eyes, I felt something wriggle uncomfortably at the idea of lying to him. I didn't, but I've chosen to accept it and live this way. So it's not like I'm better than others like me. I just want to do what I have to without being an asshole about it, I said finally. It felt like a lame explanation, but that didn't make it less accurate. There were other very valid reasons to hate slavery, but my personal situation was what gave my feelings teeth. It was the difference between recognizing something existed and was bad and having had your head kicked in by it. This was personal, rather than simply intellectual for me. And you can do something about bloody mana fever? Aleem asked. I can try, I said, not quite willing to say yes or no. He was giving me Bambi eyes and it made me feel like an asshole for getting his hopes up. Compared to Aleem, I seemed to have a pretty high understanding of medical concepts. Unfortunately, that was a relative statement and didn't make me anything like a doctor. My knowledge was a shallow kind that didn't include general medicine, let alone something like virology. At least not beyond the scope of what could be casually absorbed reading random articles or watching less than accurate TV shows. If I didn't have literal magic at my disposal, I wouldn't even be thinking about trying this. The job, I'll take it, Aleem said. I was jolted out of my thoughts and looked at him in disbelief. I haven't even sent you terms yet, I said, not quite believing what I'd heard. Well, please do, he replied cheerfully and held out a hand. I realized a beat late, he wanted to shake hands. I reached out and he took mine in a grasp I barely felt. I was cautious about not using any strength, since I didn't know what I was capable of. After shaking several times, he let go and looked at his hand with a livelier smile than before. All right, I said, as I put my hands behind my back. My orbs flickered as I looked at his smile. I couldn't explain why, but I felt like I was getting myself into trouble somehow. You feel like smoke and peach skins, he said, grinning for the first time. He had a dimple on the right side. Yeah, this was going to be trouble. Chapter 26. Contract Negotiations. After a few moments of contemplation, I made a decision. It was better to handle the contract now while Aleem could explain things to me and vice versa. I'd meant to allow him to leave so he could refuse without feeling scared if he wanted to. I was still going to do so, but it wouldn't hurt to have the contract ready first. So how much are you paid normally? I asked, realizing I knew nothing about the local currency. 2 silver a day and meals when I'm garrisoned. 3 on active duty, and 1 if I'm at home but still go for training musters. Earl Saviks sets the standard, and he's always been generous with wages like that, Aleem explained. I nodded to acknowledge him, not to agree. I had no idea if that was good or bad in the grand scheme of things. How much do most villagers earn in a day? I asked, knowing I wouldn't like the answer. Half a silver or so, depending on what they do, Aleem volunteered. So, your money is coins, and they go copper, silver, gold? How much copper to make a silver? I asked. Oh, that would be 10, though most people just cut them up. Same with gold, 10 silver makes a gold coin. Merchants weigh the bits to make sure it matches up to the value, Aleem said, then pulled out a silver coin from a pouch for me to inspect. It had a cross mark on it, which I assumed was to make it easier to cut. So villagers possibly made a literal half a silver rather than 5 coppers. Are copper coins not used as much? I mean, why not just use the lesser coin instead of cutting up a silver? I asked, baffled by the idea. Aleem looked at me and opened his mouth to speak before closing it again and looking thoughtful. I honestly don't know, he said finally. Do you have other forms of currency, I mean money? I asked. I'd come from a place with paper money, so it struck me as odd it didn't seem to be a thing. Nobles and particularly wealthy merchants use checks, but I don't know much about those, Aleem said with a helpless shrug. How much would you need to make to feel like you were middle class? I asked. I received a blank look. Shit. That probably wasn't a thing, and the term certainly wasn't going by his expression. How much would you need to make to cover the expenses for your family and feel comfortable for a year? I corrected lamely. 60 gold or so. Aleem said after some consideration. Doing the math, that was close to what he'd make in a year if he was garrisoned the whole time with no days off. I hated math but did a bit more. Okay, I feel like I kind of get things now. I'll send you a contract to review shortly. Don't feel like you need to accept it. Just treat it like a draft and let me know if you see anything that's a problem or have questions about, I said finally. Despite Aleem's enthusiasm, hammering out an employment contract wasn't a quick matter. Particularly since I was woefully ignorant on a lot of important points about local customs. Not so much because I wanted to honor them, but more because I lacked a frame of reference to communicate effectively. So, I can do what I like on my days off? Aleem asked, both eyebrows raised. Yes, I replied simply. Aleem looked at me funny, then touched his prompt. I wondered if he was checking tooltips because he didn't believe me. After a few minutes, he finished reading and let out a heavy sigh. Something wrong? I asked, not understanding his reactions. He smiled in a cheerless way. I feel like I'm going to wake up on the verge of death with all of this having been a hallucination, he said, scrubbing his face as if to wake himself up. I didn't know how to feel about that. I made a vague noise as my brain failed to produce useful sounds. Earl Savik's is generous. He gives monthly days off and occasionally half days besides. Weekly leave isn't something I've even heard of, Elim explained. I nodded, figuring my terms would be pretty different from what he was used to. Well, they aren't guaranteed, which is why you're on salary. A guaranteed amount of pay for the year. If needed, you'll have to travel or complete projects and won't get bonus pay for missing days off. I do pay you every day, no matter if you work or not. I've basically got you on call, I explained, pointing to the lower section about work days. I didn't plan on working him excessively, but I had no way to predict how much or when I'd need him. There was also the fact he'd probably end up away from home for extended periods. I felt like if you couldn't go home at night, your employer owed you something for the inconvenience beyond meals and lodgings. Okay, then what's a stipend? Elim asked. Money to cover food, lodgings, and any travel and work-related expenses. Like if you need to buy something for me, I pay for it, not you, I explained. Elim blinked several times, then nodded. I felt like I'd just added significantly to his feeling this situation couldn't be real. I'd like to accept the contract now, Elim declared. Really? There's nothing you want added or changed? I asked, flabbergasted he wasn't even trying to bargain with me for anything. No? Your terms are beyond generous, and you said you'd do what you could to help my village. What more would I ask for? Elim returned my question with one of his own. I thought about it for a moment, then had to sigh. He didn't even know what a stipend was. What exactly did I think he was going to ask for? A 401k? Fair point. I'll revise it a little more, then send you the final, I decided before revoking the contract. I'd sent it expecting a much more intense debate, so now I felt like I should recheck it just in case. There is one issue. To work for you, I'll have to buy myself out of service to the Earl. That means going to the main garrison, which will take 2 weeks. Is that all right? Elim asked. I don't want you to do anything that will get you in trouble, so leave his service the right way, I said, not exactly happy, but seeing it as necessary. It wouldn't do either of us any favors for him to get in trouble with the local authorities. Besides, outside of his village's problem, I didn't really have an immediate use for him. At least not one requiring him to be somewhere specific. Buying stuff and adding it into the inventory for me to clone only required access to a market. I doubted he'd have to do any extravagant traveling to find one. Once he was out of the desert anyway. How much will it cost? I'll cover that, I offered. That shouldn't be needed. I'll just turn in my horse, if it's still here, Elim said, looking a bit grim. You paid for your own horse? I asked, surprised. It took some saving, but I bought one to get out of the infantry. I was lucky I already knew how to ride, Elim told me, looking proud. I felt a little shiver of displeasure at that. My sensibilities were different, and the idea he hadn't been provided with all of his gear didn't sit right with me. It also occurred to me he might have been paid less before getting a mounted position. Happy thoughts. It didn't matter because he was about to leave Earl Savik's service for mine. I'll be right back, I said, then left to check the view from the entrance. It was early morning, and I could see several horses grazing. None of them was close to one of my owned plots of land. Feeling like performing an experiment, I went creeping in the early morning shadows until I was close to a pair. I pulled both of them into my inventory. They populated the store under uncommon goods. Seeing that, I released the original pair, then checked to see if the copies were compatible with my crafting tabs. They were, but I didn't check the dismantling option. I didn't need to butcher one of them for no reason, even if it was a system clone. I had complex feelings on the subject I didn't want to explore. Best not to poke them with a stick until I was ready. I don't know if any are yours specifically, but there are horses in the valley, I said when I got back to Alim's room. I was surprised to find him tossing chunks of beef jerky out of the door to the hounds. Stalin and the lady were waiting to chase them with wagging tails. It was an odd thing to witness, but I kept that to myself for the moment. Since all parties seemed happy with the arrangement, I had no reason to interfere. I definitely needed to ask the hounds how much and how often they would eat, though. I'd been negligent on the point. That's good, they're probably the bandits, so I can claim them, Alim said with a grin. Nodding, I looked the contract over before making a couple of quick edits and sending it. Guardian not defined, choose a guardian. The prompt had a little box icon. When selected, it opened my monsters tab in the store and my dungeon inventory. Looking at my options, I closed the one for the active monsters right away. Stalin and the Lady Hound were the only ones worth sending, and I wasn't going to do that to either of them. Partly because I wasn't sure they'd be able to survive and because it was overkill. Alim needed someone to watch his back and help him in a fight, not burn in at the countryside. I found a better fit in earth elemental creatures. Alim, are you a cat or a dog person? I asked, though I felt like I knew the answer. Who would be a cat person? He asked with eyebrows raised. The Lady Hound laughed her huffy laugh while Stalin woofed appreciatively at the quick answer. Chapter 27. A quick study. After some snickering, I selected an elemental earth hound for Alim. It looked like rocks held together by moss with glittering black gemstone eyes. More importantly, it looked like a good boy. At rating D, it was formidable but not insane. It was also a creature that might reasonably appear in a variety of areas without eliciting terror. I felt like the last point was necessary in case he had to use it in public. Intimidation was useful at times, but it had limits and wasn't something I wanted to rely on. You could only push the peasants so much before it was pitchforks and torches time. As a bonus, the Earth Hound was an excellent tracker, had a strong sense of direction, and the ability to find water. The latter was something it needed to keep its mossy coat nice and lush. Or at least that was what I decided to assume because I thought it was cute. With that done, I sent the contract. Take your time reading it and make sure I didn't change the terms unfavorably, I cautioned. Since Alim had already looked at one version, this would be a good moment to slip in something fucked up, were I of that inclination. I wasn't, but that was a good mentality to have with any kind of contract, in my opinion. Oh. Not to be grim, but you should relocate your family once you're out of the Earl's service. Just in case, I said. The thought was unpleasant but necessary. Even if everything went right on our end, there was still a lot to go wrong. That's easily done. My mother's family left her property in the back country where they won't do quarantines or burnings. I was worried about not being able to find healers, or we'd already live there, Alim said agreeably. Property? I asked, surprised by the news but happy. Your mother, she isn't a commoner, I take it, I said, holding back the strange sense of elation I felt. His life matching up with my idea of a proper backstory was childish, at best. Not that it stopped me from being excited. How did you know? Alim asked. I pointed at the sword I'd carefully put back before he woke up. It wasn't a thing an ordinary family would have had, even if it wasn't a crazy magic metal. Swords should be expensive in pretty much any era. Or pseudo-era as the case may be. Land ownership also wouldn't be available to anyone outside of the aristocracy. Probably anyway, I wasn't anything like an expert in feudal systems. I really needed to start looking into the local one. I had no idea how important an earl was. Well, truthfully, we're no longer noble. Her father was a baronet, and that's not a hereditary title. Besides, he threw her out when she got pregnant with me. That was the family coat of arms from her mother's side, Aleem said glumly. Your grandpa sounds like a charming man, I grumbled. Reading about a bag of dicks noble who made people's lives hard in a story was one thing. That was the stuff of character development and relatable struggle. Knowing someone who'd suffered because of their shitty grandfather was another thing entirely. I kept thinking of Aleem as a game character in some respects, but he was a real person. It irritated the hell out of me to think someone had been unkind to him and his mother. Aleem hummed questioningly. Nothing. If your grandmother's side had a coat of arms, shouldn't they still be noble? I asked, confused by the way it was discounted. It might have been an inheritance thing, with it not passing down through female descent, but I wanted to be sure. I had some choice things to say about his grandfather but kept them to myself. It wasn't my business. Aleem seemed fine talking about it, but that didn't mean it wasn't uncomfortable or painful to dredge up. That's a bit hard to explain. Her family had a coat of arms and were noble once, but they weren't sure when or where exactly. Her great-great-grandfather took that secret with him to the grave. Or maybe pretended to because he didn't know. The heraldry is strange, though. It's probably foreign or old, Aleem explained. The bit about his great-great-grandfather having one over on the family almost made me laugh. That would be fucking hilarious, though I thankfully kept that to myself. Why is it strange? I asked. I thought it looked nicer than most examples I could think of from my old world, but that was bias. I didn't know enough to pick on something like there being a weird element or color. The fact the rose was drawn nicely might have been the issue itself, after all. Most heraldry art I could think of seemed a bit ugly to me. No other families have flowers that I know of. It's always animals, helmets, or hands, things like that. I don't know much of the why, but I've seen a lot of noble coats of arms working for the Earl, Aleem said thoughtfully. He ruminated for a while, then shook his head. I think they must have a rule about flowers, or just think they're weak, he added. Roses benefit from being fed blood, I said offhandedly. What? Aleem asked. Blood, well, blood meal, is good for roses. They grow better with a bit of it, I repeated. I could vaguely recall it being a good source of nitrogen. It didn't seem like I'd been terribly interested in plants. Like most things I knew, it was probably gleaned in passing during a life saturated with information. Slaughterhouses would sell it to be used for plants where I'm from, I added to clarify, though I wasn't sure if I did or not. Aleem looked over at this sword and then smirked and laughed. I wouldn't have suspected, he said with a smile. About the horses, would you get in trouble for selling them? I asked as an idea occurred to me. No, not as long as I hand in the bill of sale to the garrison, Aleem said after some thought. I have to report it, but I'm entitled to any goods found, he added. I nodded at that since it made sense to me. It would be hard to keep soldiers from taking spoils, so it was likely easier to make it official policy. Well, I thought it might seem unlikely for you to cross the desert with a bunch of horses on your own. There's a village that trades horses a ways down the range. If you go that way, it might seem more believable that you survived, I offered. The desert wasn't that wide here, but he had been left for dead. It was probably more believable that someone injured had chosen to stay near the mountains. The path was more accessible, and there would likely be water. Particularly since I didn't find anything like a compass in his gear. It trades horses? Are you sure it's not a post town? Aleem asked. What's a post town? I asked instead of answering. I knew one definition for the term that didn't seem relevant to our discussion. It's a town on trade routes meant to ease travel. Merchants and officials can get fresh horses and spend the night, Aleem explained. I thought about what I'd seen and couldn't say for sure if that were the case, but it was likely. Possibly, I only observed it for a short while, I admitted. I wasn't going to get into detail about my creeping on the settlement to size up potential victims. That was a TMI I couldn't see being helpful to myself. I'll be able to send a letter if it is, so I hope so, Aleem explained. I nodded, feeling a bit awkward. Our business was done, so to speak. For a few minutes silence stretched between us while I tried to think of anything else we needed to discuss. I came up blank all too quickly, an unfortunate but inevitable turn of events. It was selfish, but it would have been nice to keep Aleem a bit longer. I couldn't justify it without a solid reason despite my personal feelings. He would genuinely be more useful to me outside of the dungeon. I'll give you some extra supplies, and you can think about the terms of the contract on your trip back, I said with ease. I didn't feel. I wasn't worried about him leaving before he accepted. He'd already agreed to the first one that would keep him from fucking me over. Worst case scenario, he decided not to take the deal, which really wouldn't hurt me. I doubted he'd back out, though. Even if he decided the village was a lost cause, he genuinely worried for his mother and daughter. Signing on with me would let him do more for them than he could on his own. That's fine. I'm a quick reader, Aleem said. I tilted my head in confusion, not sure why reading speed mattered. Contract accepted. Dungeon asset acquired, Aleem, employee. I felt my orbs flicker as I looked at the alert. Seriously, what was I going to do with this kid? Chapter 28. A family man. Kindly think harder about things like this in the future, I said flatly. Even reading fast, Aleem couldn't have done more than skim the contract this time. He was genuinely lucky I hadn't changed anything that would work against him. I sincerely doubt I'll be faced with this choice a second time, Aleem replied with a grin. Cheeky little shit. Well, that's probably true, I conceded. I wanted to be annoyed, but honestly, his quick decision made things easier on me. I could also test some stuff while he was still here that I couldn't have otherwise. Let me check a few things, I said as I started opening tabs. I knew how monsters worked, more or less, but Aleem was listed as an employee. That wasn't covered in the tutorial, and after some looking, I found it wasn't in the manual either. He showed up under the Monsters tab, his entry featuring a picture of him and some basic facts. It made him look like a fighting game card, and I chuckled. I couldn't help but start humming the theme to a TCG anime as I took a look. The only visual thing about his entry that stood out was the border was gold instead of black. It also auto-sorted to the first position on the page, which I felt was handy. If I needed to find his entry in the future, I'd probably be in something of a hurry. Okay, so I've found your information, I muttered as I started scanning the details. You're level 7 overall. 5 levels of warrior and 2 of fighter, I added more clearly. I couldn't help but wonder if warrior was an NPC class. The heroes in the dungeon hadn't had secondary classes like that, and one of them had been a fighter. Reset, yes/no. I jerked my hand back as I realized I'd been unconsciously reaching for it like it was a physical button. I'd been about to flush this kid's life work. All without so much as a "by your leave" in a moment of curiosity. Rude, to say the least. Oh, I can reset your class, I said aloud. I felt embarrassed with myself for acting thoughtlessly. Like they do at the temple. Aleem asked in open shock. I honestly have no idea. So that's a normal thing? I asked. I had no idea what was available through the temple or otherwise. Normal? Well, it's expensive, but it can be done, Aleem said, running a hand through his hair as he thought about it. I don't know if this is the same, I admitted. If it is, my levels will be reset to 1, but I can progress as a fighter from the start, Aleem explained. Is that worth losing all your other levels? I asked. I have a friend in the Duello Temple. He said that if you reset, your progress is faster the second time. I'd be able to get back most of my levels in a year or 2. So yes, Aleem said, his face suggesting he was doing some serious calculations in his head. I did some calculations of my own. A D-level monster was stronger than Elim was currently. Even if he did end up back at level 1, his guardian would be able to protect him from reasonable threats. At least as well as he'd have been able to defend himself. "I'll do it if you want to give it a try," I said finally. Elim wasn't going to be much more at risk this way. "All right." "Oh, hold on," I said as I remembered share mode from the tutorial. No sense in explaining everything when I didn't have to. "Here, you should be able to see the interface now," I added after changing the setting over. There wasn't any indicator that it happened, but Elim blinked in surprise. A moment later, he started studying the interface. "What does hereditary qualities mean?" he asked as he looked at the various info tabs. "That means things you inherited from your parents at birth," I explained as I selected the tab. There were 2 listings. Mega size. The recipient can perceive mana, allowing them to see if an object is magical, a spell is being cast, or a spell is in effect automatically. By concentrating, they can see spirits, mana's flow in the natural world and detect ley lines. With practice, they can come to see them at will. Inherited from Erica Silverleaf, mother. Adaptive bloodline. The recipient's offspring are more likely to inherit positive traits. Positive inherited traits are more likely to be in the active rather than dormant state. Negative traits are less likely to be inherited. Negative inherited traits are more likely to be in the dormant rather than the active state. Crossbreeding has a lower chance of complications and spontaneous negative traits. Inherited from Castor Gray, father. The effects of adaptive bloodline made me wonder if his mother's condition was genetic and he'd just been skipped thanks to his father. It didn't really matter, but I had to say, more than a few nobles would probably kill for that kind of thing. Especially if they were half as inbred as the ones from my old world. That explains a few things. My mum didn't know why, but we could see things my father couldn't sometimes, Elim said with a thoughtful tilt to his head. Seems handy. Now that you know what it is, you can probably train it, I offered. I had no idea of how exactly, but knowing was half the battle. It's saved my hide a few times, Elim agreed with a nod. Let's check the next tab, I said and selected the Divine Record tab. This tab had 2 columns respectively labeled blessings and curses. Each of those columns was subdivided into active and inactive. The active blessing was empty, along with both the active and inactive boxes for curses. The lack of curses was a positive sign about Elim's character in my book. In the inactive blessings area, there were 4 total from 2 gods, 3 from one named Glamora and 1 from Duello. Seems like you've made a good impression on Glamora, I said jokingly. The 3 blessings were labeled minor. My father liked him best out of the various agricultural gods, Elim replied, expression blank in a shocked rather than unimpressed way. Belatedly I realized that getting a god's favor was probably a huge deal. Well, shit. I decided to let Elim take his time reading while I did some quick research. Glamora, deity NG. Glamora is concerned primarily with agricultural practices, animal husbandry, and family. Though most commonly worshipped by farmers, he is not concerned with the size of the land managed. He considers kitchen gardens or window boxes of herbs to be valuable. His blessings are harder to come by than most agricultural deities because of his focus on family. He has no interest in those who tend their plants well, but neglect their relationships. I looked at the entry nonplussed. Glamora was humanoid, emerald green in color, and ribbed. I didn't know what I'd been expecting when I looked him up, but bodybuilder wasn't on the list. His weapon of choice was a scythe. He was married to a female deity named Thelia, who ruled over the home, emphasizing the hearth and family. Thelia was the color of soot, and her hair was a literal fire. They made a handsome couple and had several children who I wasn't going to look up for the moment. I looked at Elim a little differently after reading about them. He'd already come across as caring toward his family in my limited experience, but this was different. Just worshipping Glamora would require a very family-centric mindset. Elim actually managing to earn the deity's favor meant he'd not just lived up to those teachings, but impressed the god several times over in this case. Belatedly, I realized I was looking things up out of order. I knew what the word blessing meant, but not in the context of the system or this world. Blessing. The favor of a god expressed as a tangible reward. May take the form of items or abilities. Non-heroic classes can receive them in the inactive state but require church intervention to activate them due to number constraints. I looked at the redacted word and felt my orbs flicker. That was odd but not as strange as when I'd tried to look up the root eater. It struck me as weird that something stopped the gods from handing out their favor freely, but it wasn't relevant to me either. You can activate blessings? Elim asked me. Surprised, since I was thinking about other things, I looked over at his entry again. Sure enough, there was an option. The blessings from Glamora would cost 25 mana each, while the one from Duello would cost 50. Oh, yeah. That is legitimately a little strange, given what I am, I said, as I mulled it over. Gilmore and Duello were both neutral good deities. It made more sense I'd be able to activate things from evil or chaotic ones. Or possibly just curses, for that matter. I'm too broke to do it today, but I'll think about it. The one from Duello looks pretty useful, I added. Linguist. The blessed one learns languages more quickly than others. They will be blessed with knowing one language of their choosing they have encountered but not learned immediately. They will learn other languages they encounter passively at a rate of 1% per day or 2% per day if pursued actively. Despite the cost, I made a mental note to buy the blessing in a few days. Shoring up my dungeon's defenses was more critical, but it was too useful to pass up. Do you have any idea how you earned it? I asked, genuinely curious. Elim looked a little uncomfortable, a slight blush spreading on his cheeks. Not exactly, but... There's really only one thing it might have been, Elim admitted uneasily. So, I was a little drunk at a festival, Elim began, and I was all ears. I felt like no matter what would follow, I'd be entertained. It wasn't one of Duello's, but there were still a lot of acolytes around. They started talking about Nocta, Duello's daughter, and said some things. Elim's mouth hardened into a thin line as his jaw tightened visibly. Nocta? Hold on a moment, I said and quickly looked her up. She was a minor chaotic neutral goddess of trickery. Not well liked, even by her father's followers, though there didn't appear to be direct antagonism between the two. Okay, go on, I said. Elim nodded, seeming to appreciate the chance to compose himself a bit better. My father taught me never to speak ill of a lady, and they were talking about their god's daughter. I'd have been enraged if someone talked about my Bess like that, Elim continued. I wanted to laugh but held it in. I didn't know how the locals thought about it, but I felt his perspective was likely a bit unique. So I'm guessing you tried to reason with them, but that failed. How many of them were there? I asked. Elim was talking in broad terms, so I doubted he'd have volunteered that on his own. Started with 2, ended with 4, and took 2 men from my unit to drag me out of the mire, Elim said flatly, blushing hard. I couldn't hold it in and finally laughed. He'd fought 4 men over the honor of a disfavored minor goddess. Not out of devotion to her or her father. His actions had been motivated by nothing more than his values, the same ones he applied to other mortals. No wonder Glamora and Duello liked him. Chapter 29. Nom de guerre. Once I was done laughing, a few moments had passed. Elim sulked a bit, but I chose to ignore that. With nothing more to examine in his data, it was time for the reset. I'll reset you now, if you're still sure you want to do this, I said. Please do, Elim said with a begrudging nod. It seemed he didn't enjoy my mirth at his expense. Don't take it the wrong way. I'm impressed, not laughing at you, I said, as I okayed the reset. I wasn't lying either. His mentality was interesting and it had made the situation comical, rather than him. As soon as I okayed the reset, his level counter grayed out and his class had a drop-down arrow. Selecting it, I found a list of classes I found familiar. Oh, it looks like I can give you pretty much any class. Your options are Fighter, Mage, Rogue, Bard, and Cleric. What would you like? I asked. Picking a completely new one might present issues, but I was willing to deal with it if it happened. Aleem had been a good sport and I felt like I should deal with him as fairly as possible. Fighter, thank you, Aleem said, more relaxed this time. I nodded and did as he asked. The level counter went back to normal and displayed he was level 1. After what he'd told me, I'd expected it, but there was an arrow next to it, which was curious. I selected the arrow and it changed from 1 to 2. I felt my orbs flicker and kept selecting it until it wouldn't go any higher. It topped out at level 4. Aleem looked at me in open-mouthed shock and I just shrugged. I had no idea why it had let him advance like that. I did have a hunch though, and looked at his other stats. They were significantly higher this time, despite his level being lower. I think it converted your warrior levels at half value, rounded down, I explained. NPC classes sucked but tended to be cheaper, which sort of balanced them in the few RPG systems that used them. It was also possible the 5th level of warrior was still counted as experience points of some kind, but I didn't see a counter. Oh, where do you want to put your stat points? I asked when I noticed more arrows had appeared by his vital statistics. I don't know. The Earl has a crystal where we can check our levels but normally we don't get to make choices like this, Aleem explained. Really? You don't get a notice or anything when you level? I asked. I'd overlooked that I didn't know how the locals interacted with the system. Only once, when I prestiged to Fighter from Warrior. Such communications are considered holy, and not many people receive them. Most of the time, you have to go to a church or even a temple and pay to use magic crystals, Aleem explained, looking deep in thought as he answered. My mind drifted back to the censored part of the encyclopedia entry about blessings. It seemed like something screwy was going on, but it was out of my hands. Well, try thinking about how you prefer to fight and let that guide how you use your stat points, I offered. It was all I could really do, since I had no experience with the class. You've also got skill points to assign, I added, and Aleem looked a bit overwhelmed. I couldn't really blame him and let him take his time. Agility, strength, and intelligence, Aleem said finally. I was a bit surprised by the third choice, but it made sense. He was a living, breathing person, not a game character. Dump stats were not a smart thing to have in his case. His skill points also increased a bit after the intelligence stat bump. Spread the skills evenly after maxing out survival, Aleem said, more decisive this time. Not a bad choice really, since that was a skill where you'd be hosed if you didn't have it when you needed it. All done, I said once all the skill points were spent. How do you feel? Not exactly different, but a few things seem a little clearer than before. Like I think I could actually manage a decent deadfall trap on my own now, Aleem said, and gave a rueful chuckle. Fair enough. Once you're out in the world and using your abilities, you'll probably feel something a bit more concrete, I said without concern. I knew he was stronger than before going by the numbers, and that was good enough. He could take his time feeling out and getting used to the changes. Thank you, for everything. What should I call you? Aleem asked. I felt my orbs flicker. I'd forgotten about picking a name. What are these mountains called? I asked, my map not telling me. The Mountains of Laurel, named for the goddess who made them, Aleem said, surprised by the question. If someone asks who you work for, I'm the Hermit of the Laurel Mountains. Between us, call me 42, I decided, doing my best not to laugh at the joke. As you wish, Mistress 42, Aleem said and bowed to me. It made me want to ruffle his short hair, but I held off. He was an adult already by the standards of his society and a father. He wouldn't have taken me treating him like a kid very well. At least not once he realized that was what I was doing. I did a little imitation curtsy. So, at this point, I don't really have a reason to keep you. Would you like to leave today or tomorrow? I asked. It was still early in the day, but I didn't know how he was feeling. Despite his wound being healed, he could be sore. Today please. I'd like to get to the post town and send a letter ahead of the report of my demise to my mother, Aleem said. I felt bad because my brain instantly added greatly exaggerated to his words. All right, I'll put out a bath and some clean clothes. You can leave after you change, I said, which earned me a confused look. Are baths not a thing? I asked, as a deep dread filled me. I knew on a certain level some cultures in my old world just wiped themselves down, but outside of very specific contexts, I couldn't get behind that idea. They are, I'm just surprised. Surprised and grateful, Aleem said quickly. I nodded and pulled up a stone block before adding a body-length depression and filling it with water. Might be cold, I warned, as I deposited a makeshift towel and clean set of clothes. Since I didn't have a human standard sense of temperature, it would have been pointless for me to check the water. Reasonably, I could have warmed some up over one of the hounds or used the lava areas somehow and let Aleem judge it, but I didn't try. So long as there wasn't any ice in the water, the worst outcome was he'd be uncomfortable. If I fucked up with hot water though, the consequences could be unfortunate. With my hosting duties on the point fulfilled to the best of my ability, I left the room. Since his departure was imminent, I busied myself getting Aleem's pack ready. I upgraded things to a better level than I had for his comrades. I even upgraded a horse. I didn't feel as squeamish about it, unlike with dismantling. Since I hadn't summoned any of the horses I was using, I felt more like they were a concept of a horse rather than actual animals. I could be wrong, but I accepted the idea out of convenience to keep my stomach or its equivalent from roiling. Once they were done, I put the bags of gear into the room without looking. After a while, Aleem emerged from the chamber clean and freshly dressed, carrying the lantern I'd provided. I'd been a short way down the tunnel waiting and floated over. Did you check the gear? Did you need anything else? I asked, wanting to make sure he was good to go. It wouldn't do for him to leave and find he was short of something important. To that end, I'd filled 2 backpacks to bursting with everything I had thought he might need. I did, and you've outfitted me quite generously, Aleem said with a wry smile. All right, try putting your spare bag in the item box then. Just so you can get familiar with it, I said, having forgotten about testing that earlier. I'd included access in the contract, but until I saw it in action wasn't sure if he got his own or just used mine. Aleem did as I asked, and it turned out he used mine, which made things easy. I'd be able to pass him stuff and receive things without him needing to visit. Neat. You can also stow the horses in it if you'd rather not fuss with looking after them. That's useful, Aleem said, looking surprised then mulling the implications over. I'd already become accustomed to that combination of expressions from him. The various WTF wonders of my powers had inspired it quite a lot during our short acquaintance. Last thing before you go. I wasn't responsible for it, but some of your comrades died. I paid the others off to keep my secret, but not them so. If you could pass some money along to the families, I'd appreciate it, I managed to get out haltingly. I really had nothing to do with their deaths, but I'd benefited from them. It felt wrong not to offer something in return after they'd given me points, however unwittingly. I can do that, mistress, Aleem agreed with a warm smile. I handed over a pair of coin purses and he finally started for the exit. It was hard to make out, even with lamplight, thanks to the shed, and I made a quick decision and removed the structure from the tiles I owned. A patch of light appeared ahead in the tunnel. Aleem stepped into it, becoming little more than a silhouette to my vision. He waved goodbye and I waved back. This might be the last time I'd see him. He'd agreed to the contract, but I hadn't put in any clauses about needing to visit. It would be easy enough for him to fulfill his job without ever returning, just sending the occasional report. Mistress, Stalin whined, giving me puppy eyes. Friend, not food, I said quietly, which only caused the whining to intensify. What? Aleem called from mine's entrance, not many yards away. Nothing. The lady hound and I both said at the same time, though with very different tones. Chapter 30. Co-workers. Neutrality was humming to himself as he picked out his vending machine lunch. His work on the dungeon core Evil had pushed off on him was proving interesting. He'd expected to find most of the issues with it were due to Evil's sabotage. The truth was turning out to be more complicated. Evil had certainly disadvantaged the core, but not in particularly profound ways. Turning off the help desk was annoying, but it wouldn't have mattered much if it were on. Not with how they closed 90% of tickets. The real problems Neutrality noticed had deeper roots than he'd expected. They laid not in the top-level settings but in the code of the interface itself. That was a place that Evil didn't venture casually, if only because of laziness. Some unexpected changes and faults were to be expected. Any system chaos had significant influence over would alter and shift no matter what anyone did. What Neutrality had found wasn't random mutations, though. What he was combating were intentional changes. To that end, Neutrality had moved all of the core's data off the central server into a sandbox. Running it on a system mirror, he didn't have to worry about an update ruining his work by restoring the faults. Nuuu. Evil hissed in bored annoyance. They were waiting for their turn at the vending machine, but Neutrality ignored them. He'd felt annoyed with Evil at first, but now it settled down to his default level of mistrustful dislike. Neutrality glanced back with pursed lips but didn't say anything. Despite the incident with the password, Evil hadn't used his name since. He didn't mind it but couldn't understand why. It seemed like an obvious way to make insults more personal. That was the sort of thing Evil adored. On second thought, he reconsidered. He'd seen them reduce an intern to tears with a slight head tilt once. Maybe his name was too much of a low-hanging fruit. Everything in that machine tastes like shit. Punch some buttons already, Evil complained. Yeah, but if you get the right combination of shit, it tastes okay, Neutrality replied with false innocence. Even he didn't believe that magic formula existed. His only problem was that he couldn't decide if he wanted savory or sweet. Evil raised a disbelieving ocular ridge. They didn't complain further, and Neutrality did try to make up his mind quicker. If he was too long about it, they might demand he prove his claim. Neutrality chuckled a little at that. As much as Neutrality disliked Evil, nothing they did fell strictly outside of what could be called work. The same could not be said of Chaos. The last time Chaos had looked like they were working for a prolonged period still made him shudder. All of the interfaces in the office had started vomiting raspberry jam. Neutrality had spent a very sticky week learning 4 coding languages and 2 actual languages to sort it out. That Neutrality was accepting intentional sabotage as work by comparison was a sad thing. Yet, such was life. Fuck, look who's gracing us with their presence, Evil groaned theatrically. The vending machines were located in a nook just past the lounge and elevator lobby. Plenty of other employees were present, but Neutrality had a bad feeling about Evil's tone. It was an odd thing, being a system admin. You had your side, but you also had to play nice with ones you were in opposition to. The powers that be said, keeping the system up and running was the priority rather than factions. So like it or not, everyone played along. Mulling over the various strange bedfellows he had to deal with, Neutrality caught sight of Good. They were moving with purpose through the lounge toward the vending machine nook. The nook they had no reason to even acknowledge because they always brought their lunch. Oh, Neutrality squeaked, failing to keep his discomfort in check. Showing weakness in front of Evil wasn't a bright idea, but he couldn't help it. Where people slunk away from Evil's path, they sought out Good with open affection. They basked in Good's grace, saying hello or stopping them for a quick chat. Neutrality was trying to become one with the shadows and drab wallpaper of the nook. Neutrality, that's your lunch? You have to eat the best to be at your best? Neutrality flinched at the memory of Good's words. Every day at lunch, he'd heard them, just after that reassuring hand landed on his shoulder out of nowhere. Neutrality had taken to eating in the bathroom to avoid that. He'd asked for a transfer to a new office to avoid that. Now months later, Good was looking for him, and Neutrality felt nothing but dread. "Time's up," Evil said suddenly. They reached over and pushed some buttons at seeming random. Food fell down, and they grabbed it from the slot and shoved it at Neutrality. Despite the rough gesture, Evil didn't actually touch him. Neutrality had to scramble to catch the food as it slid down his chest. The shock of it broke Neutrality out of his thoughts. Good looked away as someone greeted them. Neutrality took the opportunity to make a break for it. He could eat hiding under his desk as easily he normally ate at it. He'd done an emergency drill to that effect just after his transfer. Neutrality knew there was no honor to be had in avoiding his problems but didn't care. It wasn't until he was almost to the office that he noticed Chaos running toward him. Or at least making motions like someone running. The way they were flapping their appendages implied an attempt at speed, even if it didn't quite manifest. "Where's the fire?" Neutrality was cut off as he was shoved hard. Instead of slamming into the wall, he found himself tripping across an unexpected distance. He landed heavily on thick carpet. For several jarring seconds, he wondered if he'd died. It felt like he'd landed in hell, between the red lighting and faint smell of piss. The blare of metal music and mirror gave away he was just in Evil's bathroom. It was filled with the melodic growl of "Cuked by Death." It wasn't his idea of a good time, but he often heard it leaking out of Evil's headphones to recognize the metal band. Chaos had shoved him through a wall. The how was best not thought about. The why was a more troubling issue. Getting to his feet, Neutrality made a point of washing his hands. He had no desire whatsoever to know what kind of horrors the black shag might have been marinated in. He also studiously refused to look at the toilet. It would be clean, but he couldn't get over the horror of the padded shag carpet seat cover that matched the lid cover. He'd used it once before in desperation. He hadn't been able to shake the sinister feeling of a furry toilet seat for the rest of the day. Compared to that sensation, whatever was dripping down the walls was easier to process. The faint oozing gave off a sweet scent and never quite touched any of the metal posters pinned up. Neutrality finished scrubbing his hands nearly raw. As clean as he was going to be with burning his clothes and giving the rest of his body the same treatment, it was time to go. He did his best to ignore his environment as he headed for the door. It was locked. Seriously? Neutrality muttered to himself, head resting against the door. Chaos was chaos, but they'd never done anything like this before. It was one of the things that made the change in office assignment bearable. As much as they might distract him, waste his time, or ask him to do things for them, his new co-workers didn't interfere. Or at least they hadn't before. Locking him in a bathroom was definitely interference. "Oh my, is Neutrality not back yet?" Law's voice faintly filtered through the door. Neutrality felt himself freeze. Seeing Law in the building usually didn't bother him, but this was the office, not some random elevator or hallway. Neutrality couldn't help a shiver. He recognized Law's tone of voice even before he heard a rustle of paper. It was the one sound that always heralded bureaucratic doom. Outside the bathroom in the office, Law surveyed the area without apparent emotion. Non-regulation appliances, excessive personal effects, several fire hazards, there was a lot to take in. Especially since one of the fire hazards appeared to be escalating into an actual fire. There was a lot to see, but Law wasn't interested. They gave the code violation-rich office a cursory visual scan before they focused on their target. The single clean and orderly desk in the whole room. Neutrality's, with its neat name plaque, stood empty along with the rest of the room. Only a multitude of cold ceramic eyes from the gnomes on Chaos's desks seemed to be watching. Law shifted their weight, a stack of paper reaching from their navel to clavicles resting in their hands. A brief smile flitted across their lips as they looked at the in-tray on Neutrality's desk with ill intent. Then Law took a few steps closer to their target. A slight tingle of pain in their hand gave them pause. A misaligned staple had pricked their thumb. They ignored the annoyance, ready to set the stack down as a hand slammed down, blocking the tray. "What cha doin'?" a sinister voice inquired, words rolling like molasses or congealed blood from their lips. Evil was standing close enough that Law could feel the chill radiating from their body. Close but not quite touching, mouth set in a display of teeth that couldn't be mistaken for a smile. One just shy of wide enough to qualify as hostility, according to the employee manual. Neutrality has made some errors in his recent work. Particularly in regard to the use of proper forms, Law said, but didn't try to set anything down. Instead, they backed up half a step to try and establish a personal bubble. Evil slid into the gap, both shielding the desk and continuing to violate Law's personal space without contact in a single move. "Are you his immediate supervisor?" Evil asked. "You're aware I'm not. I'm a system admin," Law said as if unbothered despite their earlier retreat. Respect for personal space, like holding elevators, was not a rule but rather a social convention. As long as Evil didn't touch them, no law was broken. "Did a supervisor or other superior designate you to bring Neutrality anything on their behalf?" Evil continued. "No," Law said flatly. "So you took it on yourself to, what? Compile a mountain of who knows what and force it on him like you had some kind of authority?" Evil asked and laughed with cold eyes. Evil didn't seem to move, but even as Law stepped back again, the distance between them didn't decrease. "I get it, Law, you're used to dealing with everyone being in spineless awe. Neutrality never questioned anything you dumped on him when he worked in your office, but this isn't your domain. I will bring you up on harassment charges." Evil leaned in and purred the last part in Law's ear. Law drew back as if they'd been burned, shivering with a look of disgust. Threatening Law with a rule wasn't something many would ever think to try. From under their desk, Chaos let out an eerie giggle, and Law felt the eyes of the various gnomes turn hostile. No, this office was not part of the domain of Law, let alone order. "Do let Neutrality know I stopped by," Law said before turning to leave. Evil waved as they left. The smile they'd pasted on dropped as soon as Law was out of sight. They had kept it out of their voice, but now they were panting from having dashed from the lounge. "I'm going to jam that stack up their ass in triplicate if they try that again," Evil growled. Chaos nodded as they came out of hiding. Evil's eyes drifted to the bathroom door before returning to Chaos. "Good came sniffing around earlier too," Evil said matter-of-factly. Done speaking, they went back to their desk and put on headphones. It was a quarter of an hour before Chaos finally let Neutrality out of the bathroom. Neutrality didn't complain about how long it had taken. He gave Chaos a thankful smile and got a nod in return. Toward Evil, he didn't quite know what expression to make. Evil didn't do things they didn't want. By the same token, that didn't mean their motives were benign, even if what they did was helpful. It didn't matter, though. Going back to his desk, Neutrality took a can of Chaos beverage from his stash. He debated a moment then and set it down across the divider on Evil's desk along with one of his vending machine trail mix bars. Neutrality wasn't thanking them for the save with good or Law. Evil likely had personal or work-related reasons for that. No, he was thankful for something different. The debt of gratitude satisfied, it was time to figure out what had prompted Good and Law to take an interest in him. Chapter 31. Splain and to do. Once Elim was fully out of sight and earshot, I let myself laugh. It was fucked up, but Stalin had looked really cute when he was begging to be allowed to murder him. The lady hound rubbed up against my side, wanting pets, and she got them. Stalin was sulking now, which didn't diminish his cuteness in my eyes. "How about I make you guys a dining hall and put the bodies in it?" I asked, remembering that I'd taken their snacks away. By the pool, the lady hound said, yapping happily at the idea. I immediately constructed a room, then tossed the bodies from my inventory into it. The guards I'd buried I decided to leave where they were. I could make proper graves and tombstones for them later. Their deaths had freed me from worries about my tithe, so I felt I owed them something in gratitude. How often do you need to eat, by the way? I asked as I gave the lady hound a good scratch. Eat? The lady hound asked me with her head tilted. It was weird, like she didn't understand the world. You know, bite, prey, chew, swallow. For energy, I trailed off as my confidence waned. We live on fire, Mana, Stalin said, confused but seeming to catch on better. Then why were you gnawing on bodies earlier? I asked, something twisted uncomfortably in my guts. I felt like I wasn't going to like the answer but didn't withdraw the question. I like how they fizz in my mouth. The lady hound barked enthusiastically. I enjoy chewing bones, Stalin said more calmly. I was seriously glad I had decided not to try using them or a different one of their kind as Elim's guardian. They were cute, but absolute fucking terror on legs. I'll have to see about chew toys then, I said as my insides tied themselves in queasy knots. I'd been more accepting of the idea of them savaging the dead when I thought they needed to. Since I now knew it was recreational, my tolerance suddenly dipped uncomfortably low. That wasn't their problem though. Let me know if you need anything or have questions, I offered, my mind drifting to build projects. Why go out of your way to help humans? Stalin asked flatly. I was surprised by him taking me up on the questions option. I'd expected something like a demand for toys or a bigger habitat area if anything. After my surprise faded, I took a moment to consider the answer. I had plenty, but most of them weren't something Stalin would care about. Well, partly because I used to be one, I admitted without any shame. I wasn't one anymore, but I still remembered things and could sympathize. Mostly anyway, or at least I wanted to. I knew how I'd died, but not who I'd been. Without any personal info, it was hard to tell what the source of the facts jumbled up in my head were. It was an academic concern, rather than a practical one. I considered myself formerly human, so for all intents and purposes, I was. Second-guessing that without new facts was pointless. And? Stalin demanded, dissatisfied with my answer. I thought about it, but they were wearing uniforms. I don't know who Earl Savix is or how important he is, and I'd rather not tangle with him needlessly, I admitted. That wasn't all of it, but seeing the symbol of a fist breaking arrows on their chests had given me pause. Unless I had a pressing reason to, killing soldiers wasn't a smart idea. Someone would probably come looking for them. Later that might be an easy way to net points, but it could also backfire horribly. Even if the soldiers weren't strong individually, all it would take was numbers. Pebbles wouldn't break a bone, but an avalanche of the things would do the job just fine. And helping the whelp and his dame? Stalin demanded. Elim had been ditched by the others, he'd technically been free game. He was also probably worth a fair amount of points, since his alignment was lawful good. That hadn't escaped my attention, despite letting him go. Letting him live was partly a whim. I'd already let the others go after all. It felt cheap not to let him leave because of a little bad luck, I admitted. Some shaky-ass reasoning morally, but nonetheless true. I doubted that Stalin would understand or appreciate my even sketchier reason of simply liking the young man once I got to know him and kept it to myself. The bit about his mom wasn't though. When I was reading the entry for the disease, I found out it was manufactured by another dungeon. I could be wrong, but I feel like it's not good to let them run amok like that, I explained. My hatred for anyone who'd choose disease as a vector of attack was difficult to explain. Not wanting another dungeon to get a shit ton of points off of it was the best I could come up with to try and make him feel better. The encyclopedia entry had listed the creator as Dr. Satan, along with the facts of its incubation and spread. It also listed the name its creator had given it as Super Elite Magic Cholera, and I strongly wanted them to die in a car fire for that. I was bad at names, but that just felt like an attack on my eyes. See? She has reasons. The lady hound yapped triumphantly. She had seemed on board for what I was saying from the start, and I gave her an appreciative scratch. Stalin still wasn't happy, but instead of demanding an answer, he seemed to be thinking things over. One of my old masters allied with another dungeon, another fought and died in the struggle against a stronger competitor, Stalin acknowledged slowly after a long pause. I nodded but didn't think too deeply about the revelation. It might be smarter to try and work together, but I felt no desire to try that with Dr. Satan. I hadn't even needed the primal jolt of territorialism I'd felt when I realized that another dungeon was at work. My only feeling on the subject was fuck that literal plague rat. Is that all? Stalin asked, still not satisfied. I couldn't exactly blame him. He'd witnessed my awkward-ass conversation with Aleem. I'd been exuding an introverted teenager trying to make friends vibe, not dungeon master. Maybe it was lazy, but I hadn't put much thought into my decision on the point. A small gain in exchange for resources I didn't really need had been fine. I still dug around in my brain for a new point to make. The exercise wasn't entirely for Stalin's benefit. I wanted him to understand and feel confident in my logic, but that was a secondary goal. Really, I was trying to wrap my head around the matter from his perspective. Unlike me, he had a kind of purity of purpose. Even if it was late in the game, I should be looking for personal advantages to the situation. Ones that spoke to my needs as a dungeon, rather than the more nebulous ones linked to my problematic sense of self. I took a couple of moments to think it over, and the hounds waited patiently. I turned the matter over in my mind repeatedly, seeing it from new angles. Doing my best to strip away the more knee-jerk impulse behind what I'd done. Like shifting tiles on a map, something finally clicked into place. There was a very good reason I should want to do something about Dr. Satan. I need a local population. They'll point out where I am and let adventurers buy supplies and things, I began, warming up to the idea. There was a difference between being somewhat remote and fully removed from any kind of settlement. If everyone dies, it's going to be a lot harder to draw anyone in. Especially if they assume the area is cursed or they'll catch the disease, I finished. I felt proud of myself because despite bullshitting it after the fact, it was still a valid reason. See, mistress is clever. The lady hound said, laughing and brushing against Stalin's side affectionately. Clever enough to give that male a sword to kill her with when their alliance fails, Stalin responded severely, throwing his nose in the air. I felt my orbs flicker in surprise. I had decided to give Aleem the repaired sword, but I wasn't sure how Stalin knew that. Well, I'll have to build this place up so he can't, I said wryly. I wasn't worried about that eventuality. Less because it was impossible because of the deal, and more because I felt confident I was more valuable to Aleem alive than shattered. No sense in killing the goose that laid the golden egg, at least not without significant cause. Sounds metal, I'm in, the lady hound said cheerfully while Stalin kept his grumbling up. Blackmore, that's what I'll call you, I said to the lady hound. I couldn't remember if it belonged to a band or a guitarist, but it made me think of metal. I like it. Blackmore said approvingly. Race you, she howled in challenge. Stalin scrambled to his feet and took off, letting out a deep howl as he raced after her. Watching them go, I felt a little jealous. I wasn't fast. Or at least I'd never gone fast. Curious, I went chasing after the pair, wanting to find out. Chapter 32. Shiny keys. I lost the race badly, but like a good sport, once I caught up with the hounds I gave them victory pets. After that, I settled in for a lava soak. It was hard not to remember what had happened to that poor bastard in the tutorial, but to me, the heat was only pleasant. Like a hot tub instead of the distilled essences of nature's fury manifest. Once I was settled in comfortably, I decided to do some investigating. I could always quiz Elim about things via text, but it was better to do my own research first. Earl Saveeks. I decided to look him up first as a starting point. Unsurprisingly, I got a stub and disambiguations. Earl Saveeks. 6th generation ruler of the Saveeks earldom of Dridmar. The stub offered minimal information about the man himself and no options to find out more personal details. It would have been nice if it offered more on that point, but I didn't sweat it. I didn't have any plans to start shit with him, so hopefully, I'd have time to find out less directly. Inheritable noble titles of Dridmar. These titles generally belong to those who have served a current or past monarch exceptionally well, usually as a family over the course of generations. Fallen royals will also be found in these ranks. These tend to be branch families who fell out of favor or sometimes descendants of other lineages than the current rulers. Foreign royalty from a defeated or annexed state will sometimes receive noble titles. Inheritable noble titles include Earl, Count, and Viscount. I learned quite a bit from that single entry, but had no idea how I'd make use of it. The map with political boundaries featured in the corner of the Dridmar entry was more useful to my immediate interests. Going by it, there was a fair distance between the nearest border of Dridmar and my little stretch of the Laurel Mountains. Likewise, the nearest part of the earldom to me was some hinterlands nowhere near the majority of its cities. It wasn't so far away that they couldn't send troops if they wanted to, but I wasn't in a convenient location. Next to Dridmar, separated by some swampland and other inconvenient terrain, was another kingdom entirely. Stromholt, which wasn't as large but sheltered on most sides. A few smaller nations existed alongside them, but I was distracted by a lack of information. Behind the Laurel Mountains was essentially a blank, despite the continental geography being clearly depicted. It was kind of weird, but not something I could do much about. It was entirely possible no major political entities existed on that side. Hell, it could be full of nomadic elven tribes for all I knew. I didn't feel like that was particularly likely, but decided not to dwell. My time would be better spent focusing on learning about my new world. To help with that, it would have been nice to have a full-size copy of the map on hand. With that thought, a window opened, but it wasn't the notepad this time. It resembled an old-school image editor, of all things. On one side was a list of tools, on the other a color palette, undo history, and layers. Feeling gleeful, I selected a fine-tipped brush. I expected to have to paint with my finger, but to my surprise a solid black paintbrush appeared in the air. It looked like it was made of a similar, if not the same, material as I was. All save for a bit of paint on the end of it matching the default color, which was a grassy green. Paint! I squealed aloud. I immediately started painting, excited by how the brush responded like a real one despite the interface. The paint flowed easily, creating a green line on the floor behind the editor. I felt my orbs flicker, as I took the scene in. I ducked down to look around the window. The line was still there, my brush had painted on the ground, physically. I could edit my physical environment. Mistress! The hounds called together in worry, as I let out an eerie sound. A squeal of glee did not translate into anything comforting or cute with my current vocal configuration. I'm okay. I called back and laughed. Just found the art interface, I added. It was all the thought I could spare before diving back in. My art interface could affect physical matter directly. I was going to thoroughly test all my new tools. It was the only revelation thus far that made me want to kiss the system for one confused and elated moment. I used the undo and found the first paint line I had made disappeared as if it had never been. My excitement ratcheted up a notch and I created a transparent layer. I painted a messy rainbow of random squiggles on it as I tested out the full capabilities of the brush tool. The brush had classic shape options and I could resize them, so it took a little while for me to exhaust it. Flood fill had its charms as well, but I wasn't excited by it. I deleted the layer and moved on to the next tool. This one was a set of sculpting tools. I could sculpt stone freely, as if it were soft clay. In normal tile editing mode, I could select a section and raise or depress it as I wished, and that worked in the editor as well. I could pull up a pillar from the floor and carve as I pleased. I was on cloud 9 by the time I got to the stamp tool. It could be set to pattern, erase, and emboss. Pattern would place the stamp in a color of my choice. Erase and emboss would add or remove material up to a set depth. The only thing remaining once I had a handle on the stamp was a box icon. Selecting it, my inventory opened. Intrigued and giddy, I selected one of the mine lanterns I'd restored earlier. It appeared in the window, and on inspection, I found it was the actual lamp rather than a 3D model. I went through many layers of junk art before I calmed down. Next, I had to focus and gain mastery of the tool sets. The process would take time, but I understood the basics after a short while. I could have spent days doodling with a carving tool in stone and never gotten bored, but I forced myself to focus. For the first time, I noticed something a little off. I wasn't exactly painting so much as coloring the material. I didn't think it was bad, but it wasn't like a powder coating or enamel. The metal was just green, and that looked funky. I tried to figure out why by digging through the brush settings, but didn't turn up anything. It wasn't until I looked at the color selection more carefully and clicked the palette tab that I found out why. Under the palette tab was a drop-down menu that included a list of dyes and enamel paint. These both had drastically smaller selections, but when used actually applied the substance. Thinking about it, I realized that the color options matched up with what I'd received from dismantling the Savik's uniforms and Elim's sword. Quickly opening my inventory, I started messing around, trying to combine the colors I had to make more. Thankfully, a new window appeared when I did, allowing me to easily mix the existing colors and filling in the intermediate shades automatically. The only problem was that for the enamel I didn't have blue. A fraction of a second later, I opened my crafting interface and put the green enamel into it, hoping it was a combined color rather than a single pigment. I got lucky and gave a little hoop of joy as it dismantled into blue, yellow, and white. I didn't have cyan and magenta, but I'd make do. It seemed like the system's pigment mixer was more forgiving than actually hand mixing the colors. If I'd been doing it manually, I'd have gotten muddy garbage using the normal primaries. I regretted not making a copy of Elim's locket now so I could scavenge oil paints from it. I consoled myself with the knowledge he could buy me some instead. Now that I'd found the art interface, the list of things I wanted would be a mile long before he reached the post town. Armed with an expanded enamel palette, I went back to painting the lantern. I did a basic flood fill of the shade and body, then used yellow for some pinstriping and scroll work. It looked alright at first, but I overdid it in the end, making it look gaudy. Utility items should show some aesthetic sense, but there was a limit. I started over with the yellow and kept things simple the second time around. For a little contrast, I painted the wick control knob red along an arrow to indicate what direction to turn the knob. A nice, but simple design in my opinion. Feeling pleased with myself, I put it back in my inventory. With the interfaces temporarily closed, my eyes caught the refresh countdown. I had 10 minutes until it hit. I did a double take. Oh fuck. Chapter 33. Quick thinking. The time hit me like a bucket of ice water. I needed to use up my remaining mana, but I didn't have a plan because I'd fucked off literal hours playing with paint. Shit. As I knew already, my strategic abilities did not improve under stress. I needed to think quickly but stay calm and make a useful purchase. I ruled out traps and monsters immediately. They required more time than I had to study in order to implement properly. Decor was out on principle, it was a non-priority. That left surface or interior dungeon tiles. I thought hard about them for several painful minutes. Interior tiles were cheaper, but I had a lot of them already. Exterior tiles had their charms, but I didn't own many yet and I wasn't sure what I'd do with the area. That was when it hit me. I didn't have a strategic reason in mind yet, but surface tiles would allow me to implement something new I'd almost forgotten about. I could add curb appeal. I had 100 project ideas forming in my head as I danced in bouncy circles. My dungeon was going to be magnificent. I spent all of my remaining mana and felt a deep sense of relief. I hadn't lost anything through carelessness and would soon be back up to full. Shopping done, I looked up to the mana counter, and my relief at spending my mana fast enough evaporated. My mana was 80/100. I immediately started digging through my notices trying to figure out why. After looking through my alerts I couldn't find anything to explain it. That was when I noticed little dots beside the mana counter that hadn't been there before. Selecting the mana counter produced a drop-down. 5 mana upkeep monsters, 15 for employee medical benefits. What the hell? I selected the tooltip and it opened to reveal a rather large brick of text. I read it several times to make sure I understood it and eventually felt like I did. Legal jargon condensed, it essentially meant the system had made a subsystem to fulfill the healthcare condition I'd included in Elim's contract. This was the cost to run it. I titled my head and opened my store, feeling like 15 mana was a rather specific price. I checked the potions tab and the most expensive physical healing potion was 15 mana. Well, that explained why the number seemed familiar. Greater healing potion, legendary S. Restores the state of the body to peak health including the regeneration of limbs and organs. Brain injuries are also addressed, but can take up to a week to fully heal. Can restore the deceased if administered within 10 minutes of death, if the brain isn't removed or destroyed. That was a hell of a potion. Everything short of catastrophic head trauma seemed reversible. I had to wonder if decapitation was a deal breaker or if you could hold it in place on the body. Or if it would just regenerate a body if you only had the head. My own head full of gruesome images, I decided to table the matter entirely. I didn't have a test subject to cut up and slash or any desire to actually see that happen. My morbid curiosity had limits. As for the upkeep cost in mana, I decided to just eat it. If it auto-dispensed potions to Elim it would be worthwhile to not have to manually be notified and send them like I originally thought I would. That the upkeep would be charged even when none were used was annoying, but manageable. One question I could answer though was what the fuck was even in that kind of a potion. I hesitated to buy it without reason though, and picked a cheap one instead. Another of the ones I'd used on Elim to be exact. Despite only costing 1 mana, it had forced an arrowhead out of a wound unassisted. That wasn't regrow limbs magical but it was pretty miraculous on its own. It only suffered by comparison. Potion in hand I dropped it into the deconstruct tab and was rewarded by a list of 6 herbal ingredients, some kind of special water, and a recipe. It cost 1 mana to deconstruct but that was negligible in the grand scheme of things so I paid it. Checking through the results I found the plants were mundane if a bit hard to find normally. The recipe was also a fairly straightforward set of cooking instructions. The only 2 things that stood out were the water and the fact that an elemental fire source was required for heating. Elemental spring water, grade C5. Water from a natural spring located on a monolay line. Due to its pure elemental nature it cannot be contaminated through mundane means and is resistant to heat. The water's resistance explained the need for the special fire. I'd have to figure out how to get my hands on a source of that or teach the hounds to hold really still. I chuckled at the notion of Stalin balancing a small cauldron on his head while I stirred some random brew. As fun as the idea was though, this little experiment wasn't a priority. I put it aside mentally and got back to thinking about my more immediate needs. Since I was still going with my mana reserve plan I technically only had 40 mana to use until just before refresh. After a little consideration I decided to make buying lava tiles part of the purchases I'd make at the end. It was a recurring cost on the low priority side. It was fine to put it off until the last minute. Buying potions to deal with bloody mana fever also went into the end of day purchase list. I could spare a couple mana and build up a hoard without issue. They just weren't important enough to make part of my active purchases. If something came up and I used my reserve I wouldn't feel the loss of them. With my budget planned, more or less, I considered how I'd approach things. It didn't take me long to realize I was still missing a critical component in moving forward. I hadn't decided on a plan or theme for how I'd build out the dungeon fully. I wasn't feeling much inspiration, which was problematic. I could leave the whole thing natural and just go with it's a bunch of caves full of monsters kind of deal, but that seemed like a bad idea. Partly because who would even want to deal with that? Too much danger for an uncertain reward. What would an adventurer even hope to get out of a place like that? A hodgepodge of trash left over from the victims of a monster's meal. The appeal of a dungeon in my mind was a promise of adventure and treasure. A nest of monsters wasn't the same even if there were rewards to be had. A proper dungeon offered the kind of loot that spoke of olden days, magic, and even lost civilizations. The inelegance of it chafed me already. My dungeon needed to be attractive to outsiders so I could lure them in. It needed to be aesthetically pleasing to me because I was going to live in the fucking thing. I didn't even want to think about living in the dungeon equivalent of a college dorm. All necessity and a fine view of a brick wall. No, as much as I might not like my circumstances, I didn't hate myself. I picked out a beautiful valley to live in and I was going to have a goddamned view. No matter if I was above or below ground. That left the question of how I would proceed, but sadly I was drawing a blank on inspiration. There were a few simpler decisions I could make though. Like what I'd focus on for the very brief rest of the year. Looking at my map of the exterior of the valley, I decided I'd focus on interior purchases instead of topside. Curb appeal was nice, but it wasn't like I had neighbors, and with my tithe accounted for I could rest on my laurels safely for a bit. I headed up to the topmost layer and realized I had another problem. I hadn't set up any design terms or other more basic planning elements. That simply would not do. Chapter 34. Infrastructure Planning. Necessity was the mother of invention, and if I was going to make progress I needed some constraints. I needed to decide on the rules of how I was going to build my dungeon. Until I did that I'd just be awash in the dauntingly large pool of possibilities. It was such a basic thing. Ask someone to draw you an apple and they would give you 50 in an hour. Ask them to draw whatever they liked and they'd have a blank sheet of paper at the end of that hour. Alright. Terminology first, I muttered to myself. Layer. A single plane in the dungeon may include multiple connected or disconnected areas. On one hand, that was more technical than it needed to be, but also vague. Layer. A single plane with an entry and exit point. That was better, if not particularly more illuminating. That was hardly all that would go into making up a dungeon though. The more obvious addition would be boss areas, but thinking about it, I recalled something from games I felt would be a good import. Boss room. The area in which a boss confrontation occurs. It should be marked by a themed entrance. Safe zone. An area free of monsters and traps that allows adventurers to rest. Not my best work, but I could refine the definitions later. I started sketching out a crude miniature map as an example. Safe zones would probably seem counterintuitive to most, but I thought of it as just another means of exerting psychological control. If adventurers expected them, they'd push to reach them instead of setting up shop in cleared areas. That would leave them at my mercy much longer than if they just stopped when they got tired. Mistress, what are you doing? Blackmoor called out cheerfully. I could work anywhere technically and had been just off from the lava pool chamber. Doing some planning work, I explained. Also, call me 42. I think I'm going to keep it as my name, I added. Strange, your name still says pending to us, Stalin said, startling me as he came over. He'd been lounging and I thought he was in too much bliss to care about what I was doing. Wait, you can see I stopped. I could see names floating over their heads, but I'd taken for granted that I was the only one with the privilege. Right. Give me a moment, I said, then opened my personal info tab. The familiar fields showed up, but with a little concentration I found the name field shimmered for a moment, then filled in on its own. Better? I asked, and both hounds barked jubilantly. Many scratches and pets were given before the pair went back to play. On my own again, I realized I was forgetting something. Hi. I made my name official today. -42. I entered the message twice, once for Agony and once for Steve. It wasn't much, but I didn't really have anything to add. My decision to call myself that was pretty much a combination of whim and coincidence. That I felt like I needed to work a couple don't panic signs into my decor as discreet Easter eggs nobody would understand was natural. A veritable biological imperative. Or at least that's what I'd tell anyone who asked. A moment later I got a message alert which surprised me. It was from Agony. I hadn't expected him to respond so quickly since he hadn't yet sent a reply to my first message. Sweet. Congrats on the name, and sorry for not replying sooner to the invite. I'm swamped with idiots. I'll get in touch and set up a visit once newbie season's over. Agony. I was as happy for the promise of the visit as the congratulations. The photo he sent of himself giving a double thumbs up was a bow on top. Steve responded almost as quickly. Congratulations 42. You certainly found the question for your answer. I hope things are still going well with setting up your dungeon. Steve. P.S. I've attached something to commemorate the event. His present was a 6-pack of cola in various flavors that changed whenever I wasn't looking. When the hounds came bounding over to see what was up, I realized that I didn't have any personal space. Enjoy their company as much as I did that was a touch problematic. Problematic but easy to solve. I created a room just off from the lava pool and dug around in my store until I found a stone door that was sufficiently heat resistant and installed it. Guys, this is. Let's go with Chamber of Machinations. You can both come in, but you need to ask permission first, okay? I said once my room was done. They both nodded in understanding, accepting my invitation to come and explore the new space until they lost interest and went back to playing. Feeling whimsical, I pushed the room back to create a space in front of it. To that I quickly added some rough stone furniture, effectively creating a lobby. I doubted the hounds would avail themselves of the chairs, but it amused me nonetheless. Once inside, I created a niche and put my gift from Stephen into it, taking one can out to enjoy. My chamber was quieter than the lava pool and I enjoyed a few minutes of decompression. As I did, the soda changed flavors 16 times while I drank it. I expected flavors, but to my surprise, the carbonation levels and temperature also changed without warning. It was an experience, to say the least. Once I was done, I put the empty back in the niche with the full ones and stretched. The sodas were a nice gesture, but what I appreciated most was how Steve had shown he got the joke. The name was mine now, and while it hadn't meant that much at first, I found my view of it changing. It hadn't given me any sort of new ability that I could see, but I felt like something had clicked. The feeling that something small but basic was missing was finally gone. I felt more myself in a way that was difficult to quantify. It was nice though, and I found myself relaxing more. My newfound zen didn't change that. I had work to do though. Opening up my art interface, I started using the walls of my Chamber of Machinations as a notepad. I carved my thoughts onto them and felt a little giddy at how easy it was to make my mark in literal stone. While I was adding the notes I'd already made, I had a moment of inspiration and quickly jotted it down. Stack. A collection of layers composed of combat layers, a boss room, and a safe zone. The layers should function as preparation for the stack's boss room and subsequent stacks. An idea for my design finally clicked into place. I didn't need a boss room on every layer. It would be fine to combine a few layers into a stack and put the boss at the end. Layer. A single plane with an entry and exit point. Boss room. The area in which a boss confrontation occurs. It should be marked by a themed entrance. Safe zone. An area free of monsters and traps that allows adventurers to rest. It should be visually distinct from other parts of the dungeon. Every layer featuring significant amounts of monsters or traps should feature one before the descent to the next layer down. Stack. A collection of layers composed of combat layers, a boss room, and a safe zone. The layers should function as preparation for the stack's boss room and subsequent stacks. I let out a pleased cackle, satisfied with having my basic building blocks defined. There were plenty more things I could and should define, but these were enough to get me started. Even without a theme ready to go, I could plan essential layouts and amenities. I also had a better idea of how I wanted to handle the issue of progression. I'd need points on a yearly basis, so I needed to draw in adventurers and likely non-adventurers regularly. That meant skewing the risk versus reward in such a way they could profit somewhat before things got too difficult for them. The first layer was quickly sketched out in blue and labeled entry level, and I added some notes next to it. Minor traps and naturally inconvenient creatures would be fine. Things a prepared non-combatant could handle. The lure would be harvestable items. What exactly, I'd figure out later, but it was enough of a plan to warrant writing down. It also meant I could leave the level in a relatively natural state. I added a striped box to indicate stairs at the back end of it. They would function as the point of descent into the upper layers of the dungeon. Despite that, I still drew 2 more layers in blue. They would be resource-rich, with the level of danger increasing in a gradual way. Still comparatively safe, but not without danger, so a few deaths here and there would be expected if you went in far enough. Because I didn't have a solid plan for the rest yet, I just drew in some colored rectangles. Green, yellow, orange, and red to indicate level of difficulty. I cast a glance toward the lava pool that I could see through the slightly cracked doors of my chamber of machination. I couldn't help but feel pleased at the prospect of moving it down to the red layer eventually. Since it would be the highest level of difficulty, I could make it a real slice of hell for the hounds to roam around in. Chapter 35. Artistic Artifice. With my mind made up, I spent my available mana on interior tiles. I didn't have a specific plan yet for the lower layers, but the top 3 in the relatively safe zone were easy enough to ad-lib. I placed the majority of them roughly in place before turning my attention to the bottom layer. I was holding off on buying lava tiles, but I added 5 normal terrain tiles to expand the hounds' area. I wanted to give them more area to run around in close to the pool. They hadn't complained, but they were being subsidized on my mana to compensate for the temperature. The dungeon had to be freezing for them. With that done, I started shuffling tiles around until I had some interesting arrangements for the second and third layer of the blue stack. They were a bit undersized, but I'd remedy that closer to refresh with any luck. The entry layer, though, didn't need any extra tiles. It wasn't glamorous, but it was perilous just by virtue of its size and complexity. It wouldn't seriously impede an adventurer, but a normal person who wandered inside would be in trouble quickly. That in and of itself had a certain amount of psychological weight to it. A boring kind of tension that was integral to a good horror movie over the simple splatter gore of a slasher. With great care, I removed the traps I'd set up already. It left an uncomfortable feeling between my shoulder blades, but I ignored it. I'd be putting a lot back, but it was easier to take them out instead of worry about moving them about while I worked. The next step was to simplify the layout. Not enough to make it completely safe, of course. Just enough that it would only take a few signs or a decent memory to get around without much potential for ending up hopelessly lost. It was a difficult balance to pull off. "Mistress!" Blackmoor called from the door to my chamber of machinations. I waved her in and Stalin followed on her heels, his posture oddly reticent. Like he didn't want to be here for some reason. "Mistress! We want to sleep," Blackmoor whined at me with big fiery eyes. "We are fine as we are," Stalin growled at her, trying and failing not to be heard. "You have my permission to sleep whenever you like. Or did you want a house or something?" I asked. "Yet. A cave for snuggles," Blackmoor said, yapping happily. Stalin looked sullen at her happiness, but his tail was wagging if one were paying attention. It seemed like he didn't enjoy asking for things. I felt a surge of annoyance at that, wondering if he'd been treated badly by his former dungeon masters. "One snuggle cave, coming up," I said instead of asking. They were tired and this was a conversation that could wait. If he wanted to talk about it at all. I didn't know a lot about psychology, but trauma was a tricky thing to deal with and it could be bad to push someone who wasn't ready. If that was even it. He might just be proud. Picking a spot with some cover from stone formations, I pressed in a little cave of sorts. If I were dealing with different creatures, I'd have put some soft bedding down too, but there wasn't anything soft in my inventory that wouldn't end up burn-in at. Let me know if you want any changes made. They don't cost me anything, I offered. A smaller entrance. Black Moor said as she ran in and out of the cave repeatedly. Stalin joined her in the inspection, both hounds sniffing every inch of the space. It took some back and forth, but they liked one where they had to crouch and crawl in to enter. The interior opened up to a comfortable height though, so I guessed it was for defense. A second way out, Stalin said after hesitating a moment. I did as requested and created a short hound-sized tunnel leading to a second exit further down. After running in and out of both entrances a few times, they finally seemed satisfied. That or they were finally too tired to care about interior design. They retreated inside and checking my security feed, I found them sleeping soundly, snuggled together. It was completely adorable and I took a picture. I was genuinely glad I had these two murderous puppies to keep me company. Companionship was as important as protection, at least for the sake of my mental health. Even so, I was grateful to have a bit of time to myself. I headed up to the mine's entrance and started doing a walkthrough of my simplified layout. Viewing it through the security feeds didn't give a real feel for what it was like to actually walk the various paths. They had looked fairly intimidating seen at a distance. Up close I found myself getting bored rather quickly. Monotonous stone passages really weren't anything to write home about. Fortunately, I wasn't stuck with using the bland options. Drawing on what little I knew of mines from my own world, I started cutting in storage and rest spaces into the stone. Alcoves with benches and pegs to hang things on were simple, but they immediately added to the atmosphere. Tickles of water, moss, bits of exposed but worthless crystal. It was time-consuming but simple to add on the set dressing needed to remove the feeling of sterility from the place. 2 hours into my project I heard a patter of feet. "Mistress! What are you doing?" Black Moor called out as she came running up to me. I gave her a scratch as she cuddled against my side. A quick check of the map showed that Stalin was in the pool. "Well, I'm working on my layout and about to do an inspection," I started to explain. "Sweet," Black Moor said cheerfully, and I couldn't help but laugh. "Which one of your prior masters talked like that?" I asked. I'd named her after an offhand comment she'd made and I was curious where she'd learned it. It also made the inspection more interesting to chat as we went. "The first one. They seemed rather young and, I want to say stupid, but that's not really it. It was like their dame had kept them in the den too long. They didn't know how to look after themselves well," Black Moor explained. "Humans would call that being sheltered." "I hope they treated you well all the same," I said as the thought occurred to me a little late. Former dungeon masters might be a sore subject, given the hounds didn't get a choice. They didn't have much to do with me. I mostly sat around, they mumbled a lot though. "Mostly about album covers and things," Black Moor replied easily. I nodded as I adjusted a stone formation to look more interesting. "Oh. Do you know what an album is?" I asked, curious if she really understood the words she'd used now. "Nope," Black Moor said cheerfully. I had to laugh at that. Metal is a genre of music and an album was a collection of songs. We could record them on a variety of discs and use machines to play them later. We'd put those discs in sleeves and things with art on the front, which is what a cover is, I explained as briefly as I could. I doubted Black Moor would want to hear about how we'd gone from wax cylinders, to vinyl plates, to tapes, back to plates in the form of CDs. "I want to hear it and see one," Black Moor said excitedly. "I can draw a cover, but I'm afraid we'll have to abduct a bard for music." "I don't really know much about it," I said honestly. I knew somewhere in the back of my mind I could read simple music, but I didn't know any songs or how to play instruments. All right. Blackmoor agreed. I wasn't sure if she was saying she was fine with me drawing or kidnapping. Scratching her behind the ears, I felt like it was probably both, given her feelings on chew toys. I definitely wanted to have a resident bard at some point. Just not a kidnapped one, despite my joke. I didn't imagine that Duras would improve someone's singing voice. Doing the entire level would take a few days, but I wasn't anxious. The thing I felt a bit worried about was the descent chamber where I'd placed the stairs leading down to the next level. Finally coming up on it, Blackmoor followed me in and I let out a sigh. It was a modest space with a high ceiling and stairs at the back leading down. By modest I meant boring. There was no sense of transition, let alone grandeur. This was just another bit of the mines from all appearances, which annoyed me. It had looked more imposing through the security feed. It was also dark, but in a monotonous rather than intimidating way. This would not do. I checked my map and pushed the ceiling up 20 feet for a total of 40. That was the upward limit I could buy for this section, but I ignored that constraint and bought the exterior tile above it. That let me punch a hole clean through, which brought a sudden flood of daylight. Ah! Blackmoor barked in surprise, scuttling behind me as light poured in. Sorry, I muttered, as I petted her until she calmed down. I should have said something, but I'd been in the zone for a moment as my vision for the room clarified finally. I'm going to keep working, you might want to join Stalin while I do. I'm going to be making some drastic changes in this area, I explained. Blackmoor agreed, giving me a good lick before she took off for the stairs. She paused at the influx of daylight, then ran for it, as if something so weak could possibly burn her. Alone I got back to work, altering the shape of the chamber and location of the skylight. In the end I had a straight vertical wall for the entry to the stairs, while I used a 90-degree angle to cut back to a shorter vertical for the entrance. Moving the skylight around for the biggest dramatic impact took time, but was worth it. I'd need to monitor how the light moved through the day, but the location felt good to me. So long as no one arrived at the latter parts of the day, they'd come to find an impressive visual. A visual I needed to make sure wasn't a security liability. I made a ramp up to the skylight to check the exterior terrain. It opened up on a short slope that led to a steep drop. If someone actually managed to get up to and use it, they'd have earned it. They would also have to be at least half mountain goat to pull it off. Taking a moment, I surveyed the view of the valley. The cut had opened out to a spot back and just to the left of the waterfall. Below, the river cut through the sandy soil like a glittering silver ribbon with a lacy edge of green. It made a pretty picture contrasted against the pinks and oranges of the surrounding sand and stone. It was almost a shame no one would likely try to climb out and up to see it. Feeling a bit playful, I made a bench. It was a start, but I quickly manipulated the surrounding stone to create a sunshade, so any who dared would find a comfortable spot to enjoy the view from. Getting it all arranged so the light leading to the chamber below wasn't obstructed was a bit tricky, but worthwhile. Even if no one else used it, I knew I'd be back, and really that was fine. This was my dungeon, I would enjoy it however I pleased. Chapter 36. Family Matters. On my way down the ramp, I heard an odd noise. A sort of bubbling that was strangely unnatural. A message alert also appeared at the same time. I checked the alert and found a notice for a potions allocation to someone named Irene Marsh. That was beyond weird. Aleem had indicated his only living family was his mother and daughter. They also didn't have a last name. Unless it was a system error, it seemed like this Irene was a distant, but important, relative, which left me with new questions. Thinking about it, I realized I hadn't asked him about his family in detail. His wife being deceased had put me off the idea. As I was contemplating how to approach the matter tactfully, another bubbling sound went off and a new alert appeared for someone named Gordon Saveeks. What the fuck? I yelped. I didn't need to guess who Gordon was a relative of. Panicking a little, I started digging through the tooltip explaining the potions system. When that failed to turn anything up, I went to Alim's information and looked through it with a fine-toothed comb. I had to expand it 3 times to find a family tree. Alim's direct family formed a tree. His mother, Erica, was linked to a grayed out box that read Castor Gray, deceased, his father. Their boxes were connected by a line and down from the center of that line a new one descended to connect them to Alim. Alim was connected to his wife June, deceased, with Bessie under them as their child. A very neat little family tree. Selecting June turned up nothing, her family tree all read as deceased. Erica gave a similar result and selecting Castor was what finally gave a result. His name linked into a new tree that was mostly listing deceased relatives. One of them joined up to a more lively third tree a number of generations back. 6 degrees of separations at its finest. Alim was only distantly related to the Earl. Probably distantly enough they might not even be aware of the connection. Despite that, I didn't think it was something I should just ignore. That didn't make it less of a fraught subject though. I had no idea how inheritance laws worked. There was a strong possibility any such connection could be inconvenient to the both of us if acknowledged. Even so, it wasn't my life or relatives which meant it wasn't my decision. I considered writing about it but gave up the idea. It was better to just call and get the matter over with. I opened my communications interface and made a call. Alim? You there? I asked once the call connected but I didn't hear anything. Mistress? How am I hearing you? Alim asked, sounding confused. Shit. I'd forgotten that this wasn't a normal method of communication. Not that it would have been in my own world either. Magic, I said then felt like a total asshole. Yes, obviously, what an illuminating explanation. He would certainly have no questions now. A kind of communication magic. One we can use because of the contract like the texts, I added quickly. Not really better, but at least more descriptive. Oh, that's quite convenient, Alim replied, sounding amused. I was thankful for his good humor and adaptability once again. Yeah, very much so. Anyway, I'm calling because of an issue of sorts, I said, struggling for how to say the next part. You have some relatives, Gordon and Irene, who seem to be in some kind of trouble. They just got potions from the system as part of your healthcare package. Do you know them personally? You didn't mention them during the negotiations, I continued. It was far too roundabout but I decided not to do anything about that. He'd know them or he wouldn't. No, but I can ask my mother once we arrive. Oh, I forgot to ask. What is the Earthhound's name? He said it was yours to decide or mine if you allow it, Alim said. I felt my orbs flicker, I hadn't actually interacted with the Earthhound. Naming them had slipped my mind. I pulled up my monster panel and found them, a male as it turned out. You can do the honors if you have something in mind, I offered. I really don't, I've never been good with names. Bessie's lucky my mother did the honors or she'd have been something like Hortensia, Alim said, and I could hear the grin. I felt like Glemora would have thoroughly approved of that choice. All right, see if he likes Marlowe, if not I can try something else, I offered. A moment later I heard Alim talking to someone else and the Earthhound's entry changed to reflect the name Marlowe. He says thank you mistress and he likes it fine, Alim. Good. I'm not really any better with names myself, I admitted. I'll have to take your word for it. About the family you mentioned. There is a bit of irregularity with my lineage, do you know how I'm related to them? Alim asked, his tone more careful than I was used to hearing. Castor Gray through your father I mean, I said, botching things a little. I was still looking at the family tree so I'd read it rather than answer directly. Castor Gray is my father. Alim asked. Yeah, realization hit me much too late, is that a problem? Are you certain that's true? Alim asked, voice small. Yeah. I mean, he was listed in your traits and your family tree. I can't see a reason why they'd both be wrong, I said lamely. All the while wondering what kind of landmine I'd just done a jig on top of like an idiot. The system could be wonky with active counts like points and mana, but I hadn't seen anything else not work correctly. No, if anything it's a relief. There was some question on the point, but he'd always been my father in any way that mattered even when it was uncertain, Aleem said and his voice relaxed. Thank you for telling me, my mother will also be pleased to hear it too, Aleem added and then laughed. Happy it was good news, I said with honest relief. I heard a baying then, either in the distance or sounding like it because the hound wasn't part of the call. It seemed excited to my ear though I couldn't make out words like I did with the lava hounds. Mistress, I'm afraid I'll have to cut this short. Marlowe smells trouble, Aleem said then cut the connection before I could say anything. My first instinct was to call him back and ask what the hell was going on. Fortunately, I was too surprised to act and the moment passed. If something were going then I couldn't help and a call would just be a distraction. It was better to wait until Aleem called me back or otherwise got in touch. Shit, I muttered to myself. I understood what the correct thing to do was, but that didn't make it easier. I did my best to keep busy, but left the window showing his stats open as I worked. It let me keep an eye on his health, which was better than nothing. Or a weird kind of self-torment I found after an hour of trying to focus but flinching every time I thought I saw a fluctuation. The health bar would only tell me if he took actual damage. He could thoroughly be in trouble and I'd be none the wiser. You better fucking call me when you're safe, I muttered to myself. In reflection of my mood I wasn't bothering with attention-intensive tasks like design. Instead I was breaking stuff. Specifically magic crystals that produced light. They were nice little bland things I could buy in any color I liked but didn't have a setting adjustment for the type of light they gave off. I wasn't particularly interested in a cheerful steady stream of it and was meditatively smacking one with a rock. I'd dropped one by accident and it had flickered charmingly before going dark. It took 6 of them before I found a level of broken that gave me unsteady results but didn't die out after a few moments. After breaking 10 of them I had 3 new options. A random stuttering pulse like a fluorescent tube on the blink, a guttering candle kind of look, and a very dim version. They populated my item shop and were 20 for a single mana instead of 10 like their functional counterparts. As hours crawled into a full day without word I found my mood and decor choices darkening subtly. It was hardly a professional reaction, but I couldn't be fucking bothered with that. I had 2 friends and a kind of okay, probably, supervisor in my very limited contacts list. The idea of losing one of them did not sit well with me. Whoever might visit my dungeon next would do well to pray my friends list didn't get any shorter. Chapter 37. A delicious new friend. I spent my time refining the blue safe stack in an irritable funk. One that caused all of my decisions to lean atmospheric horror movie a little harder than they would have normally. I still kept to the design rules I'd laid out despite it. The blue stack did feature a significant deviation from what I planned for the others. Instead of putting the stairs to the next level in random places, I punched a single staircase down from the first blue level down through the other 2. It ended at the start of the first green layer. If normal folk wanted to explore or gather things, they could easily follow the usual path. If adventurers found their way to it, they could skip the safe parts. Despite that deviation, I did still add safe zones at the back end of the layers as well as descending staircases. Though I was going easy in the blue stacks, I didn't want it to be possible to ascend all the way back up without crossing any layers. At least not without facing off against a boss. That deserved a reward and I decided to include teleport pads back up to the entry chamber in the safe zone after each one. When it was about 10 minutes until refresh, I decided it was time to spend my reserve mana. I was still uneasy about Aleem, but I couldn't really do anything for him as things stood. It was better to focus on my tasks rather than things I couldn't affect. I bought a single teleport pad and spent the rest of my mana as I'd previously planned. The hound's lava habitat grew a few tiles, I started my potions stockpile, and expanded the dungeon in general. On another day I'd probably feel content, if not rather pleased with myself. Instead, I felt annoyed at the continued lack of communication. Instead of enjoying a sense of accomplishment, I started trying to figure out what bit of work to bury myself in next. The blue stack needed expansion and refinement, but that was busy work. It wouldn't keep me distracted. My best bet was to start planning out the next stack, the green newbie zone. Starting something from scratch was always more engaging than fiddly details work. Since it was the formal start of the dungeon from an adventuring perspective, I decided not to alter it too heavily. There would be changes, architectural elements, art, a puzzle or two. Plenty of things that would give away it wasn't a natural occurrence or the work of minors. It would be a continuation of the slow burn horror of the blue stack. I started looking through my monster notes, looking for something to use as the cornerstone of its design. Monstrous natural insects and animals seemed like a good if uninspiring starting point. The environment would seem to become increasingly more malignant as familiar things turned deadly. That was a very scary to experience, boring to plan idea though. My mind was already wandering. I wanted to text Aleem and check his health like a macabre helicopter parent. I needed something more substantial to do. It wasn't the best idea, but I decided for the sake of my sanity to design the green stack boss encounter first. The excited little hum I let out at the prospect of skipping to it an embarrassing, but good sign. I started looking over my monster options a second time, trying to pick out the boss. Nothing was clicking at first, but I kept circling back to one particular monster. Skeletons, they were a staple of a lot of RPGs. I felt a sort of kinship with them on a conceptual level. They were made of human parts, but no longer human themselves. It was almost poetic in a way. They were also a D-class monster, which made them low cost and relatively uncomplicated to place. Poetry was nice, practicality was king. The only serious hang-up with them as a choice was how little character they had. They weren't anything like naturally occurring. They needed an environmental explanation other monster types didn't. I could certainly plop down a necropolis or a mad necromancer's lab. There were plenty of ways to explain them, just none that didn't feel overused to me. My tail lashed irritably as I tried to sort the matter out. An alternative to a good new idea was an interesting play on an old cliché. Since the top levels were an abandoned mine, I could link the encounter into the made-up reason that had happened. A curse of some kind. Unbridled greed was their downfall. I muttered irritably to myself. I wasn't really a fan, but it was a starting point. Instead of dwelling on the thematic weakness, I decided to start building the room. It was a bit backward, but I wasn't in a mood to be disciplined. I made a large chamber directly connected to the stairs to avoid a build alarm. With only a vague idea to work with, I set up a kind of generic fantasy cave scene with stalactites, pools of water, and other random geology odds and ends. I fussed with it for nearly an hour before giving up. It was going to need a lot of work with the lighting and lines of sight to be anything worthwhile, and my heart wasn't in it. I still felt like trying to do the general layout for the boss encounter though. Or I was just desperate to distract myself from Aleem's health bar. Nothing serious had happened, but he'd taken some damage. All of it was within range of what a cheap potion could fix, but it kept happening every few minutes. I really hoped he was just being dumb and riding through thorn bushes or something. I looked through the skeleton's description and found they weren't listed as undead like I'd assumed when I was scheming originally. They were necromantic constructs. An interesting distinction I wasn't in the mood to look up. Instead of immediately buying animated skeleton monsters, I looked in my inventory and found one of the bandit bodies. After restoring it to a more usable state, I tossed it in the deconstruct interface. I made a point of not examining the list of rendered parts too carefully. I was only after a skeleton and stuffed the rest in my inventory without looking at it. I placed a few around the chamber, wanting to create some ambience on the cheap. I gave them various weapons and laid them in a way that would mimic having fallen in combat. I felt a bit amused at how annoying the scene would be to a forensic tech. I'd essentially fashioned the scene with what would read as a set of octuplets since the skeletons were all copies of a single one. Ooh! Skeletons are tasty, Blackmore said, eyeing the decorations like treats. Blackmore! I admonished from halfway to the ceiling. She'd snuck up on me completely and I'd made an undignified squeak of terror when I jumped. I enjoy bones too, Stalin agreed, looking at me disapprovingly before looking away. That little nonverbal diss burned a bit. No gnawing on employees and decor. I'll add some to the dining room for you guys, I said, with what little dignity I could scrounge up. I slowly lowered back down to the ground as the fear-fueled rush of whatever passed for adrenaline in my case ebbed. Yes, mistress, both hounds replied with very different tones. Stalin sounded like a kid who knew the scolding by heart. Blackmore was her usual excited self. Thinking about the dining room, I realized I'd set up pretty sweet digs for the hounds as things stood. For the skeletons, on the other hand, I was essentially dumping them into a plain room. I felt kind of bad about that. After checking Elim's health and finding it steady, I bought some tiles and set up a secondary room. It would function like an employee lounge. I'd furnish it after discussing it with the skeletons once I summoned them. The skeletons in the shop had NPC classes, and that finally gave me an idea for how to set up the boss fight. If I bought enough of them, then when a party appeared they could form a matching group and face off against it. It was a little cliché, but better than my original half-baked idea of miners cursed by greed or something. I selected a warrior skeleton to start with, curious about their ability to communicate. Its stats indicated that it was sapient, but that wasn't saying a lot. Random chance determined that the summoned one was a male since I didn't set a preference. He populated to my inventory when I declined to place him directly in the room. I appreciated that bit of efficiency. It would be a pain in the ass to have to manually load everything in after placement if I only wanted to stockpile it. Skeleton 1, as he was designated for the moment, looked up at me with sightless pits from his portrait. I couldn't tell anything about him from it and had to fight down an urge to place him right away just to chat. I was intrigued by the idea of what he might be like. Instead of rushing, I took my time to study his stats, wanting to get a feel for how strong a D-level monster was. Marlowe, the Earth Hound, was D rank as well, but he was a D8 while skeletons were a D3. Marlowe was stronger than Elim before reset, though less so after, so I wasn't sure how a low D would measure up. I was surprised to find this one had 4 levels of warrior, 1 of rogue, and decent stats. Elim could have beat him, but not a group of them. I was impressed and somewhat concerned about using skeletons as the newbie encounter. I might have to push this boss encounter down a ways in the stack order. Instead of being put off, I felt my curiosity rise. Studying his entry more, I found a new tab that I hadn't noticed in the Hound's info. Checking theirs, I found it there as well, a fact which suggested it was a result of the interface upgrade. Enhance the tab read, a straightforward heading all things considered. The enhancements cost mana, but that wasn't an issue in my eyes. It was about time to start playing with options. It was a bit expensive, but I immediately edited both hounds to respawn. There might have been a manual option to do it in the event they were defeated, but I didn't care. I wanted to know that the pair would come back without issue if something happened to them. A desire that took a little work to set up in the end. Respawn didn't automatically return the original creature. Left as it was initially, it would have simply replaced the defeated monster with another of its kind. I was deeply glad I took the time to read everything when I spotted that. It would have been entirely unforgivable to lose one or both of them through such a moronic level of negligence. That also raised an issue with summoning sapient monsters in general. I'd need to do the same with the rest of them. Skeleton 1, for instance. Chapter 38. Chevalier's Wish. With the Hound's safety secured, I decided it was time to say hello to Skeleton 1. I placed him in the room a few paces away from me. He moved around in an awkward, shambling way until he turned and noticed me and the hounds. Standing to attention with a speed that would have seemed improbable a moment before, he gave a salute. No need to be formal, I said gently, amused by the reaction. I'm your dungeon master, 42, I offered. I should make a point of letting the hounds know that too. I'd forgotten about it since it had taken me a while to pick a name. Not that they'd been particularly formal or even polite with me so far. The skeleton bobbed his head in something between a nod and a shallow bow. I bit back a laugh, feeling like he'd started the bow only to abort because of what I said. How should I call you? I asked. I'd looked through his information and found some interesting things, but nothing that told me explicitly if he remembered his mortal life. As you I wish, he replied, managing to stand straighter somehow. My orbs fluttered. A telepathic stammer, I wasn't sure what to make of it, but felt sorry for the poor thing. I was also surprised by the sense of nervousness I picked up. He was physically mute, but communicating telepathically. I hadn't expected that to have an equivalent of emotional inflection. Do you remember your name? You can choose a new one even if you do, or I can give you one, I offered. A truly dangerous proposition, given my naming sense, but I could change it again if he thought of something better. And no, anything you wish would be fine, he replied. I nodded absent-mindedly, already trying to come up with something. He was human, so I only did a brief look-up of naming conventions. There were some exotic options, but it seemed like the locals used some I was familiar with. Henry James Clavicle, I offered, wanting to give him a proper full name. Yelling at people always felt best when they had a middle name to screech like an eldritch incantation. Working in a bone also satisfied my deep need for juvenile humor. That's I am honored, Henry said, bowing to me and causing my orbs to flicker. It was a jokey name, but he seemed genuinely touched. Thinking about it, I realized Elim didn't have a last name. In certain time periods, those were reserved for people of the aristocracy or military, so giving him one might very well be an honor. It's yours as long as you like it. Though feel free to let me know if you change your mind, I said simply. I slightly regretted making the name funny, but not enough to change it. That would involve explaining the joke and I wasn't prepared for that just now. As you wish, Henry said, trying to be attentive even as his gaze kept drifting toward the hounds. Stalin was behaving himself, but Black Moor was looking at him with jaws in a wide grin, salivating. I had to remind myself they lived on mana and didn't eat because she looked positively ravenous. Henry flinched back from her when she took a step forward. He held his arms over his chest like he expected her to jump for a rib. Yeah, this wasn't going to be productive if I let it continue. Blackmore, Stalin, I put some treats in the dining room, help yourselves, I said, not wanting to make the newest addition to the dungeon feel unwelcomed. Yes, mistress. They barked together before running off. I quickly set up a bone buffet to keep them busy for a while. Better? I asked once we were alone. Henry nodded, but looked away and I sensed a kind of embarrassment. Like inflection in his speech, I knew I was sensing something that went beyond his posture and gestures. It was almost like I could see the nuance lost with the flesh, though I had no idea what he would have looked like when he was alive. All right, let's get back to it, I said after an awkward pause. I didn't have a problem talking, but I didn't want to just bulldoze him. Something I felt would be easy, given how shyly he was behaving. As I wish, Henry replied. I felt my orbs flutter. That was the fourth or possibly third and a half he'd said that particular phrase. I wanted to test some of the enchantment features on you, is that all right? I asked, wanting at least a minimum of consent if possible. As you wish, Henry added tentatively after a beat. I seriously tried not to laugh and failed miserably. Henry stared at me in what I felt was dumbfounded mortification. I'm sorry, I managed after a few moments. Where I'm from as you wish is a famous quote. Or at least its overuse is, I explained. I'll try to refrain, mistress, Henry managed after a false start. This time there was some annoyance mixed in. That left me with a squirming sheepish feeling. It wasn't fun to be laughed at and he had no way to know I wasn't doing that. You didn't do anything wrong. It's just that it's from a comedy, so I laughed, I explained lamely. I'll keep clear of farce, Henry insisted. Look, I wasn't kidding about not needing formality. Speak however makes you comfortable, I continued. Ha, my social skills really were garbage. If I wanted to be surrounded by compliant drones I'd have picked sentient non-sapient monsters, I added finally. My shop had plenty of options that had the sentient tag without the sapient one. It took me a moment to realize Henry was confused by what I'd said. Sentient means intelligent, sapient means, well, similar to a human for want of a better term. Someone I can carry on personal conversations with. An ant is sentient, but it hasn't got a rich internal life. No dreams, or poetry for them, I explained, then shut up when I realized I was babbling. How would you can know of the dreams of Henry started, only to cut himself off. How might I be of service, he asked, after a beat. I sensed a rebuke of sorts in the sudden change, but bit back on my reply. We had just met, and I'd made a mess of things. Before I could gather my thoughts for a response, a notice alarm drew my attention. Mistress 42. Someone asked but I wasn't paying attention to that. Aleem had finally written. Mistress 42. I apologize for the late reply. I ran into a few inconvenient obstacles, but am fine. I should reach the post town you mentioned in a day. I thought it unwise to use your voice magic so close to it, so I ask you to forgive me for replying with texts as you called them. Your faithful servant. Aleem. How utterly charming, he'd finally written but hadn't explained a damned thing. Oh thank God, I said, feeling like I'd sigh in relief for a year if I could sigh at all. I was truly annoyed, but that didn't matter since he was all right. Which one? Someone asked. I was startled to find Henry close to me, peering into my orbs as if they were eyes. I hadn't heard him approach at all, though I didn't imagine he needed to be stealthy for me to have missed it. I was far too distracted. I just got news a friend I was worried about is safe, I explained. Henry stepped back as soon as my head raised and was in his original position by the time I was done speaking. Shy, but curious it seemed. That's, Henry started only to stop, as if he didn't know what to say. I apologize, we've gotten off to a rough start, I think, I said, as I tried to think of how to right the situation. The reason I placed you, is because I'd like to make some adjustments to your settings. Would you be comfortable with that? I asked. Why yes, I wouldn't mind that, Henry corrected himself, looking away from me. I still couldn't quite tell if he was embarrassed or intimidated by the situation. I leaned toward him being embarrassed, but I was the dungeon master, he probably had unfortunate expectations. Let's start with some cosmetic changes then. Let me know if anything feels uncomfortable, I'll stop if it does, I explained. Henry only nodded this time, but that was fine. I chose a full-length mirror out of my item shop's mundane goods and placed it. There was no sense in making the poor man play dress-up and keeping him in suspense about it. The available cosmetic changes were considerable and inexpensive. I also found that my art interface would work on him, though I closed it for the moment. I wasn't going to randomly start carving the poor man's bones without discussing it first. Parts of inert skeletons would likely become art projects later though. I didn't enjoy the idea of blood or anything of the body's meat and wet, but dry bone had an appeal. It had been a popular art medium for humans from antiquity forward in my old world. One of the first changes I made was to add something to Henry's eye sockets. There were plenty of options, most that would look a bit silly, so I settled on a pair of jewels. They looked black but were enveloped in a colored flame not unlike how my own looked. Let me know if you like a particular color, I said as I started moving through the various options. This, Henry said sharply to a particular shade of blue. It was a saturated jewel tone I found rather pleasing too. The change already added a healthy dose of eeriness to his appearance, but I wasn't satisfied. On examination of the options, I found that he had a magic seal written on a scroll tucked inside his skull. It contained the spell that animated Henry, but I found that a little distasteful. It was resilient, but still paper, making for a rather weak design. Would you mind having your seal carved into your skull? I asked, remembering my earlier decision. Skeletons could be defeated through destruction of the scroll, ruin of the skull, or sufficient overall damage. Putting the design on the skull itself wouldn't make him significantly more vulnerable. That sh should be fine, Henry agreed as he peered distractedly at his reflection. I selected the option to turn it into a seal carved into his forehead instead. If you don't mind, I'd like to paint in the carving to make it pop stand out I explained. Henry nodded and I opened my art interface. My general height was enough, I only had to rear up a bit to get into a good position to start. I accentuated the design with black enamel, so it stood out in the blue light of his eyes. What do you think? I asked, genuinely curious. It's an improvement. IW was bland before, Henry said, emphasizing bland like a swear word. I managed to only make a little snrk, but he still heard it. Despite the slip, I didn't sense embarrassment when he looked at me this time. He seemed amused now, and had even relaxed a little. It was an interesting tabula, looking at him as he stood in front of the mirror. I wanted to make a painting of it and took a picture. It would make a fine bit of macabre art if I knew what he'd looked like when he was alive. The living man looking impishly back, unaware of his skeletal reflection. I felt like I'd been struck by lightning. Now there was an idea. You are an inspiration, I said cheerfully. Searching through my store, I found a magic mirror and placed it in front of the employee lounge. The mirror had a two-way function that let those who met certain criteria pass through it. I set it to monsters. Henry gave a start when the mirror appeared, but no comment. I went and tested the two-way function, and after a feeling like passing through water, I found myself in the next chamber. I felt elated, and popped half out to signal Henry to come over. He stepped through a few moments later. Digging around in the mirror's options, I found some upgrades I could buy and giggled excitedly. Me mistress? Henry inquired. Ah, right, narration. I just had an idea for this boss fight, finally. So back here will be where everyone can hang out and do stuff. Loads of skeletons, waiting for adventures to arrive, I said and casually passed through the mirror while I was talking. Then I meant to continue, but realized that Henry hadn't followed me. I leaned back through the mirror, gesturing for him excitedly. He did, if a beat late, though the fact that I was pulling him by the arm might have had something to do with it. So all of that is hidden, then heroes arrive and they see their reflections. Read some ominous text about appreciating life or something above the mirror. Nice normal stuff until they find their reflections withering and a matching party of skeletons steps out. I spun around in a circle, encompassing the room with my gesture. Henry turned on his heel to keep facing me as I moved. What do you think? I asked. Why you care for my OP opinion? Henry asked in open disbelief. Yes? You're going to be part of the forces stationed here. It's essentially your space, you should get a say. Also, I've been doing this for like a week. It's entirely possible you have more dungeon experience than I do, I said simply. I still didn't know how to feel about monsters being recycled through the system or like with Blackmoor, captured and added to it. The best I could do was try to make the experience not suck. This is my third time serving, but I can't say I have X experience, per se. I was stationed to guard passages in a crypt. An average chess piece, Henry said, his tone bitter toward the end. That's a waste, you're literally skillful. It's a trait you have, I said without bothering to hide my annoyance. Blackmore had indicated her prior dungeon master hadn't had much to do with her either. A fact which annoyed me, but wasn't worth getting into. Anyway, feel free to speak up if you have ideas or questions. The worst I'll do is disagree, I said with a shrug. Why, you said that we'll match the he heroes. Did you mean in AP appearance or class? Henry asked. I nodded, happy he was participating. Both. I'm going to buy you a special ability so you'll mimic them automatically, I explained, purchasing the ability as I spoke. Skeletons with this enabled would copy the general appearance of their opponents. Remnants of desiccated, straggly tatters of hair, flashy bits of gear, those things would match up to enhance the psychological effect. It was an effect only triggered in the presence of an opponent though, so Henry's appearance didn't change for the moment. Next will be a reset and class change. You can be a base class or a specialization, I added. Why, you mean to let me choose my class? Henry asked, again sounding shocked. You know your own abilities and inclinations better than I do. Anyway, let's start with your base class. What would you like? I asked. Fighter, Henry replied quietly but without hesitation. Done. I'm going to set your level to 6th so we can see what your possible specialization options are, I explained. Chevalier, Henry said, still quietly but more urgently, a hand of bone reaching out to grip my arm. I was surprised but didn't pull back. Chevalier was on the list but it seemed like an odd choice for him. Between the stutter and a level of thief I'd almost expected him to ask me to spec as a rogue or one of the lighter stealthier fighter options. Chevalier was a vanguard role. It had a few spells and some party buff abilities, all woven into a very solid combat build. One that was oriented around drawing aggro and speed. It gave a very strong face of the party vibe to me. Okay, done, I said, once I finished buying the level and setting the class. I could spin my wheels trying to figure out the various advantages and disadvantages, but it honestly didn't matter. It was clearly important to the man for whatever reason and I could afford to be accommodating. Feel free to try the abilities out, I added. That was all the encouragement Henry needed. Holding one hand aloft as if holding a sword, he started dancing through a series of fluid steps. I felt my orbs flicker as I watched. He was graceful, and when he used certain class abilities, stupefyingly fast. Henry left a trail of blue energy behind as he seemed to shimmer and disappear only to reappear a distance away. I could just barely track the movement because it was a straight line and understood it wasn't teleporting intellectually. That didn't change what it looked like. I started clapping when Henry stopped, thoroughly impressed. He turned quickly, as if surprised by my presence, and I laughed. It seemed like he'd been so focused that he'd forgotten I was in the room. I take it you don't want to try a different class, I said jokingly. And no. Henry squeaked. Chapter 39. The Shiv Goblin Cometh. All right, I'm going to summon a few more skeletons and make similar changes. I'd appreciate it if you stuck around to help with introductions, but you can explore the rest of the dungeon if you'd rather not, I offered. There weren't a lot of Lava Hound free places to explore, but he might enjoy getting to move around. I'll stay, me mistress, Henry said, tone sounding a little grave before he bowed to me. I almost reiterated the lack of need for formality, but decided to let it pass. It might be more comfortable for him and I could deal with it later if it turned out to be something else. Thank you, I said simply before opening my shop. To my surprise, a new entry had appeared next to the normal skeletons. Azure Flame Fighter, the entry read, showing a default with the cosmetic and settings changes but without a class specialization. I was happy to see that I wouldn't have to change every single skeleton individually. More pleasantly, I noted that the default on the Elemental Hounds had changed to reflect my respawn preference. I'd still need to check it on other monsters, but it was encouraging to see that change was now permanent for them and any of their kind I'd summoned in the future. I picked a thief and a mage to start the next round of alterations. They both appeared in a similar state to Henry when he first arrived. shambling and awkward until something seemed to click. The thief was the one who spun around to look at me first. He had the air of an unamused cat about him. "Hello, I'm 42, your dungeon master. I'm going to be editing your classes and appearances to fit with the boss encounter you're going to be a part of. Henry here was the first one I did this for, you'll be getting similar upgrades," I said to the unaltered skeleton standing before me. "Would anyone like to volunteer?" I asked and received no response. "It doesn't hurt or anything," I added. I'd asked Henry for his cooperation properly when I wasn't sure about that. Now that I knew it wouldn't do any harm, I'd been less solicitous. Maybe that was a mistake. "I'll go," the thief said, crossing his arms over his chest. I felt like he'd have rolled his eyes if he had any. "Okay, let's start with a name. Do you want to pick it or should I?" I asked, seeing he lacked a name like Henry had. Skeleton 2 wouldn't do any more than Skeleton 1 would as a moniker. "Whatever waters the garden," Skeleton 2 replied. If it weren't for a brief blaze in Henry's eyes and a clenched fist, I wouldn't have caught on to what that probably meant. I glanced at Skeleton 2's stats and found that he had been 16 when he died. I put a placating hand on Henry's arm and shook my head slightly. He backed off, but looked the other skeleton in the eye sockets hard. I got the distinct feeling that the garden metaphor was mechanically the same but ruder than my world's float your boat. "Christopher Truman Phalanges it is then," I said, ignoring the implication of his earlier statement. At 16, he was probably going to be a moody asshat most of the time, and I decided to just accept that. I felt something like, but not quite, sympathy as I considered his situation. The idea of being stuck at 16 potentially forever was shudder-inducing. I couldn't remember being a teenager, or human for that matter. I still understood it was one of the most unstable developmental periods emotionally, despite that. Everything was raw, immediate, and important even if it was bullshit. Probably especially if it was bullshit. "Class preference? You can pick Bard, Wizard, Rogue," Christopher shouted excitedly. I nodded like I hadn't expected that, but accepted it. He had kind of a rough and shady bend to his manners even without being a thief. I felt like he'd probably been a street kid. It would make sense he'd want to stick to what he was familiar with. "You can choose a specialization if you want," I added. I was getting a prankster vibe off of him. "Assassin," Christopher replied, with the same level of joy a kid would after getting a present. I paused in shock. That was not what I'd been expecting. It felt weird to hear something like that come out of what was a child's mouth. I wanted to say no, but fought down the urge. I'd already said he could pick. Taking that back just because I was uncomfortable would only damage our very new relationship. "Okay, assassin it is," I said finally. I didn't like it, but I got the same feeling from Christopher as I did Henry. The choice mattered to them. "Seriously, just like that?" Christopher asked. He clearly didn't believe I'd do it, and looked like he was queuing up a cutting remark for when I reneged. He went utterly still as I put the change through. A moment later he was running around the room jumping from patches of cover and performing acrobatics to shame the cat I compared him to. Unlike Henry, he hadn't needed even a cursory invitation to try out his abilities. "I think he likes it," I muttered archly to myself. "It would seem," Henry agreed, deadpan. We shared a look, then were drawn back when Chris let out a loud whoop. "I want an assload of shivs," Christopher shouted happily as he dropped down from the ceiling. He'd climbed up a few moments earlier and wedged himself in a crevice like a hard-mode game of hide and seek. He hit the ground with an ominous crack and I flinched before moving to get a look. "I think you fractured your legs, let me see," I said, and oddly, the boy darted a few steps back. "I'm a skeleton, it doesn't hurt, mistress," Christopher said, and I felt another figurative eye roll. "Yeah, and you'll respawn if you're destroyed, but that doesn't mean you should just ruin yourself," I replied flatly. "Why, I'll respawn?" Christopher asked. Yeah, I said, before I realized I'd made a mistake. Christopher let out a whoop of joy while I groaned as an ominous premonition settled over me. Nothing good would come of this. Chapter 40. While Christopher, who I was already mentally calling Chris, was busy running amok, I turned to the last skeleton. Hi, should we start with a name? I asked. I want something dignified, he said, haughtily crossing his arms. Dignified? Aaron Eustace Ulna. I offered, trying to come up with something without properly knowing what constituted a dignified name. That was the kind of thing that was highly circumstantial. Aaron nodded in agreement with me, then gave Henry a contemptuous look. Also, I'd like a different color from the fighter, he said, and I would have raised an eyebrow if I had any. I was not enjoying his attitude, but made myself take a second and calm down. I was giving Chris a chance to adjust. Aaron deserved one too. Right, let's change your base class first. You can pick something to go with it after, I replied. Sorcerer, Aaron said flatly. My feeling that he was going to be a nuisance rose rapidly. That's fine, but there might be some issues as it uses blood magic, I explained. Can't I just use other people's blood? Eustace asked, clearly annoyed by the restriction. I genuinely have no idea, I said simply. Despite the potential issue and my lack of desire to invest in a class that likely wouldn't work out, I still chose it. I'd let the others pick, it wouldn't be fair not to let him. Did you want to pick a specialization or stay as a pure sorcerer? I asked. They all functioned off the base class, so it wouldn't remove the weakness, but that wasn't the point. I'll stay a sorcerer, Aaron said gravely. I took a moment to get some blood together. 2 minutes really, one of which was spent trying not to gag. I made a pillar with a bowl of blood at the top next to Aaron. Give it a try, I offered. Obligingly, Aaron said about testing his class abilities. He was more restrained than Henry or Chris, but I could tell he was excited, at least at first. By the end, I could see the frustration in his posture alone. It works, but there's a penalty, Aaron said unhappily. He swatted the bowl aside, breaking a finger and dashing the blood on the floor. I fought my sudden bout of nausea, not wanting to find out how something without a mouth threw up. Trying not to damage his dignity or my own, I scooped the mess up into my inventory. I checked his stats, but didn't find anything specific about why the blood wasn't working properly. I didn't give up, and started to look more about it in my encyclopedia. I hit pay dirt after a few minutes. Knowledge really was power. Maybe it's because it's pure human? Your class has a lineage requirement, so you're considered a tainted being according to the description, I offered, and Aaron looked at me like I'd spoken in tongues. Then I'd need the blood of another tainted, Aaron grumbled. I nodded, copying his class information and texting it to him for further study. I'm kind of surprised you didn't know that. Were you not a sorcerer when you were alive? I asked. Aaron glared at me, then his shoulders slumped. I was initiated, but I hadn't begun learning yet. I had to go into a different field, due to circumstances, Aaron said, sounding unwilling but speaking all the same. Oof, that had tragic backstory written all over it. I wanted to ask him more, but reined in the impulse. He was a real being and my misery tourism, at best, wouldn't be appreciated. I can't solve it right now, but I'll figure out the blood thing. In the meantime, let's move on to aesthetics after that, I promised. You intend to let me keep the class? Aaron asked, mirroring Chris's earlier disbelief. Yeah, you can choose to change it, but I won't do it without your consent, I said flatly. Henry and Chris had been ecstatic about their classes. I felt sure Aaron was deeply bothered by the prospect of losing his, even if he didn't show it. Shall we pick out your color? I asked as I queued up the aesthetic changes. Once the jewels were in place, I slowly cycled through colors. This one, Aaron said, as his flames turned magenta. I wanted to laugh, but managed to hold it in properly. Magenta, the color that should not be. Alright, would you like anything else aesthetically? I can carve symbols and the like, I offered. Not at the moment, Aaron said. Hey! Chris called from the other side of the room. He'd left to go exploring at one point, only to return singed and chuckling, the hound baying in the distance. I didn't comment but nodded, noticing he was pointedly avoiding Henry. Henry in turn didn't move toward him, but his eyes were tracking the young man nonetheless. It was odd, like they were sizing each other up. They really seemed to have gotten off on the wrong foot, but I couldn't do anything. At least I felt like I couldn't without potentially making things worse. My social skills were a bit dubious. Okay, all that's left is to show you guys your break room and chat a bit, I said cheerfully. I waved for the group to follow me and they did after a little hesitation. Going through the mirror with a skeleton horde looked pretty sweet. I captured an image of the moment, thinking it would make a fun addition to the decor in the break room. It wasn't much to look at for the moment. A large room with a series of alcoves along one wall, it was simply put, plain. The only thing that might have qualified as furniture were the storage chests in the alcoves, but they weren't much to look at. Just simple hinged boxes I'd crafted out of stone. So, I figured you'd all want to customize your spaces, so pick one and tell me what you'd like, I said cheerfully to cover up my embarrassment. I had a reason for not decorating, but I still felt caught out. Bookshelves and books on magic, Aaron said immediately. Good, work-related things are a must. Don't hold back about hobbies or wants though, this is your personal space. The hounds have a swimming pool, I said, wanting to convince them to ask me. If they got too greedy or outlandish, I'd just say no. Short of that, I'd try to do anything within reason. Here, everyone take some chalk and draw in anything you might want. I'll give you a little while, then come around and make the changes, I said and handed out the chunks. I'd have to refine them into sticks later. I'm only interested in academics, even for fun, so I don't need any diversions, Aaron said flatly. How utterly charming. I wanted to roll my eyes at that. All work and no play would definitely make Aaron a dull boy. Despite that, I wasn't going to force a hobby on him. All right. I think you might like this though, I said as I entered his alcove. I created an indented lip and placed a panel of slate into the wall above that. You can write math on it or whatever strikes your fancy, I added, handing over some chalk and a rag. I demonstrated what I meant, scribbling then cleaning it off. Aaron snatched the chalk out of my hand like an asshole, but started writing so furiously that I forgave him. Aaron apparently had some very important mathy thoughts that needed immediate expression. I expanded the size of the chalkboard and gave him a pile of chalk pieces to work with. I changed the dimensions a bit to accommodate thicker walls and cut in shelves after. Aaron ignored me completely. Curious what Chris might be up to, I went to check on him. He'd drawn exactly nothing in his alcove. Could you make my crypt bigger? I don't care for tight spaces, Chris asked when I arrived. It took a second for me to realize he considered the storage boxes crypts. That made a kind of sense and I rebled the break room to necropolis in my head. Obligingly, Chris laid in the crypt so I could see where it needed improvement. Lengthwise it was fine, but its depth and width were an issue. I expanded it until he didn't touch anything lying comfortably and doubled the depth. Though he didn't ask, I removed the lid and replaced it with an iron grate set like a sliding pocket door. Chris hadn't expressly said he was claustrophobic, but I figured being able to see out would help if he was. It had the added benefit of preventing anyone from sitting on the lid to trap him. Not without getting stabbed in the ass anyway. Want anything else? I asked. Chris was laying like a lazy little brat in his crypt and only shook his head. Like even speaking was too much bother. I left him to his own devices and went to see what Henry had gotten up to. Hey Henry, I started, only to fall silent. The other two hadn't drawn anything. Henry had exhausted the lump of chalk I'd given him. I like what you've done with the place, I said when my brain failed to produce anything more useful. A work table, lines indicating a wall and where he wanted a door were the start. He apparently knew something about drawing because he'd also drawn cabinets in both the footing on the floors as well as an outline of the face on the wall. There was a simple rectangle on the floor, what I assumed was a work table, but he couldn't really do more in that case. US said we could request items to keep us occupied, Henry began, then faltered. I'd like to do leather working and TT tailoring. It's why I drew a W workroom, he added after a moment. I did, and I meant it. Text me what all you'll need and I'll see about getting it, I said firmly. You don't mind that it's not us useful? Henry asked. I don't think everything has to have a specific use just to warrant its existence, Henry, I said flatly. Plenty of the things I had made and planned were for aesthetic pleasure, which didn't do anything useful like make my dungeon more efficient. That I enjoyed them was enough. Henry might not need clothes as a skeleton, but I didn't see a reason to begrudge him them. If anything, it might help to have some things made to enhance encounters. Not that I was going to force him to make things for me, but if he was up to the task and interested, it could be fun. Thank you, Henry said, giving me a bow. Any requests for reading materials and such? I asked. I expected he'd need some time to compile a tools list, but I wanted to send Aleem the first shopping list soon. I can read, but I haven't read much for PL pleasure. Some philosophy texts and mysteries I suppose. Henry replied, after some thought. I'll add them to the list, then we can get going on setting all this up, I said cheerfully. Henry inclined his head in agreement. I rubbed my hands together in glee. Henry had already given me a lot to work with, so I first blocked in rough shapes. Once I cut in things like drawers and other moving parts, I had a new flash of inspiration. Ooh, you can draw on them with the chalk and I'll make changes, I added once that initial design pass was done. Henry tilted his head, seeming amused, but accepted a new lump of chalk. Instead of starting to draw immediately, he first ground it down into a more usable shape on a bit of stone. Better armed, he got to work. Hey! No fair! Chris chimed in irritably an hour later. I looked up from where I was carving a bevel in a cabinet, annoyed at the interruption. He hadn't even asked for shelves, and that wasn't my fault. It's entirely fair. You can add things still, you'll just have to wait your turn, I said flatly. Chris surveyed me with a severe set to his posture, then turned and scampered off. Fine, I will. Chris called. I had a feeling he was going to make some horrifically elaborate drawings. Don't threaten me with a good time, I said archly. Beside me, Henry put a hand to his mouth, but it did nothing to muffle his laughter.